clean growth, reforming multilateral institutions, women-led development, international peace and harmony. For India, it's a big global moment. It's an international opportunity to present India at a global stage. Well, G20 has been that very opportunity to present India on the global map, from the beauty of the Dal Lake to the white land of the Run of Kutch in Gujarat. While the meetings held critical discussions over the last 9 months, this platform, the G20 presidency, has also showcased the unique experiences that India's diversity offers, the holistic tourism experiences that the country can offer as well. And the traditions and cultural richness have been very much an integral part of the visiting delegates program over the last 9 months. Over 150 cultural events with the participation of over 7,000 artists showcasing local and national art forms have been held across 28 states and union territories under India's G20 presidency. Now, the government is pitching India's G20 presidency as People's G20 through all of these events. And the man who has been running the machinery for the last almost a year is Mr. Harsh Shringla, the Chief Coordinator for India's G20 presidency. I welcome Mr. Harsh Shringla to the NDTV Conclave. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us. I also invite Maria Shakil, the National Affairs Executive Editor of NDTV, to please come on stage to interview Mr. Harsh Shringla.
G20 event is the most significant international event since independence. That's what you had said. Why do you think it is the biggest and the most special and fantastic event that India is hosting since independence?
Well, in the past, I'm saying in the distant past, it's 1983, even before I joined service in 1984, and that is already distant. We had two major international conferences. One was the Non-Aligned Movement Summit, and the other was the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit. Both these were big meetings, had a number of heads of state and government. But I think the difference between them and the G20 presidency that we're taking on now is that those were one-off events. I mean, those events were one major meeting in Delhi of these heads of state and government, whereas the G20 has consisted of 200 odd meetings that we've hosted across our country, culminating in a summit in Delhi. And of course, the second difference is that the G20 will bring together the most important countries of the world, the developed economies, and the largest emerging economies. So in a certain sense, the galaxy of leaders that we will host in New Delhi in 2 weeks from now will be unprecedented as far as our history is concerned.
Yes, and when India took over the presidency, it happened in the backdrop of two black swan events, COVID-19 pandemic and also an ongoing conflict in Russia-Ukraine. In terms of challenges and opportunities, you had spoken about it when we took charge, and now 10 months into it, are you one of those who will say that all the expectations that you had, India has been able to meet those?
Well, our presidency has come at a difficult time internationally. I think there's no doubt about it. The impact of both these black swan events, as you mentioned, have been felt across the world in lowering rates of growth, high inflation. But it's the developing world, the global south, that has faced the brunt of of these crises. Whether it is through the increasing costs of essential imports of food, fuel, and fertilizers, whether it's through lowering demand for their services and goods, it has led to a level of indebtedness that we have not ever seen. There are 70 low-income countries in the world today who are either indebted or at the risk of indebtedness, and that's really unprecedented. So given those circumstances, and given the fact that there is a huge expectation from the international community that the G20 will take up the mandate to provide macroeconomic and financial stability in the world, I think our presidency is very important. And we have to keep in mind the fact that the organizations, the international organizations that really should be dealing with these crisis situations, whether it's the United Nations or other international organizations, have today not been able to perform up to expectations. The lack of representation in these organizations has led to a lack of trust and effectiveness. So in those circumstances, it is the smaller groupings like the G20 that have come to the fore, that have the representational nature. They have also the necessary, I would say, wherewithal in implementation terms, because you have all the organizations, the UN, the IMF, World Bank, OECD, regional organizations like the African Union and the ASEAN as part of the G20 meeting. So when the G20 takes a decision, its implementation is across the board, is very effective. So our presidency comes at that moment. And I think, for many countries, India's presidency is, for them, a ray of hope. And we have engaged the Global South. We've had a dialogue. But from their perspective, this is an opportunity for them to, for the G20 to provide some sort of guidance, some sort of solutions to global challenges.
Yes, since you've spoken about the Global South, I'm going to take that in a bit. But before that, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi officially India took over the presidency in December 2022 in Bali, he had said that India will ensure that G20 in India would be decisive, action-oriented, and ambitious. How much of that has been achieved, particularly in the sense of inclusivity?
Yes, I think, the vision of the Prime Minister was to take the G20 presidency to a level where we meet the expectations, not just of our partners in the G20, but the entire international community, especially, as you said, the Global South. And if you see our broad priorities, how to stimulate growth, how to provide momentum to the faltering SDG process, how to use digital public infrastructure to empower people, how to strengthen multilateral institutions, and how to foster women-led development. These have been our broad priorities, and these are the priorities of the Global South. And I think even before we reach the summit, if you look at many of the 200 meetings that have happened, and especially the ministerials that have resulted in outcome documents and consensus formulations from within the G20, you can see that much of what we set out to achieve has received a lot of support and traction from the G20 members. So take the SDGs. For example, we have a 7-year plan to stimulate the SDG process up to 2030. And that has been endorsed by the group. We have a broad, the high principles of digital public infrastructure. Everybody agrees that we can use the G20's experience and expertise, and especially that of India, in terms of digital public infrastructure, to take it to countries across the world, especially developing countries, and to help them empower their own citizens, ensure that delivery of developmental and other benefits reaches the grassroots levels, as we have done in our own country. You take the multilateral development banks, for example. There's a sense that the IMF, the World Bank haven't performed up to expectations in the 21st century. The demands on them in terms of alleviating indebtedness, in terms of providing climate finance, have not been fully met. How can we strengthen their mandate? How can we ensure that there is adequate resource availability for these multilateral institutions to enable them to perform up to expectation? And there, I think, again, we have made some very good progress and success. So there is, whichever sector you take it, wherever the developing world has a certain expectations, I think our presidency has worked to meet those expectations. And of course, as we come closer to the summit, and during the summit, I think you will see a lot more of what we have been able to achieve with our G20 partners in providing or meeting or providing solutions to the global challenges of the day.
India is currently the chair of SCO, also G20. We were there at the high table, also at G7 in Hiroshima. India is part of Quad. So has India managed to send that message that, when you use that phrase, ray of hope, it is about those aspirational nations who are revisiting the global order, which was there post-World War II, which has to be, perhaps restructured in the post-COVID world?
Well, as I said, we are today in a very divided and polarized geopolitical order. And we are, as a country, I think, in a very fortunate position. And as you mentioned, we straddle that ideological space between North and South and East and West. And we are in a position to deal with our partner countries across the world on issues that are important. And I think if you look at our endeavor, it is always to work towards the larger global common good, or human-centric globalization, as the Prime Minister calls it. And in that endeavor, I think it is important that we, our theme for the G20, One Earth, One Family, One Future, I think really exemplifies our approach towards dealing with the international community, that we need to work together if we are to move successfully to the future. Mankind and the world is to move towards the future. And from that perspective, I think unity is important. Getting countries together is important. And of course, global governance, and that was your question, global governance in terms of getting international organizations that today reflect the requirements of the 21st century, include developing countries, include the African Union, for example. Africa as a continent of 54 countries is not represented in the UN Security Council, which is why India has asked for the African Union to be included as a permanent member of the G20. So all of these efforts, we hope, will result in a more equitable world order, a more representational global governance structure, and one that will enable the international community to face the challenges of tomorrow. I think that's very important.
ब्रिक्स का भी विस्तार हुआ, 5 से 11 देश टोटल नंबर बढ़ा है. भारत ने बार बार इस बात पर दबाव डाला है कि यूएनएससी का रिप्रेजेंटेशन बढ़ना चाहिए. क्या ये सब उसी डायरेक्शन में जा रहा है, और क्या आपको लगता है यूएनएससी भी रिविजिट करेगा अपना जो उनका जो फंक्शन है और जो रोल है एज अ बॉडी, ताकि जो रिप्रेजेंटेशन की आप बात कर रहे हैं, इक्विटेबल ऑर्डर की बात कर रहा है भारत, वो सब दिखे उसमें?
तो हमारा जो पोजीशन है कि यूएन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल में रिप्रेजेंटेशन बढ़ना चाहिए, ख़ास तौर से जो विकासशील देश हैं उनका रिप्रेजेंटेशन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल और अन्य यूएन और इंटरनेशनल संगठनों में आना चाहिए, वो हम पहले से ही कहते रहे हैं और ब्रिक्स में भी यही चर्चा हुई है. अगर आप देखें तो G20 में या ब्रिक्स में या SCO में जितने भी इंटरनेशनल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस में हम संसद हैं, वहाँ पे हमने ज़रूर ये पॉइंट का जिक्र किया है कि वर्ल्ड ऑर्डर जो है रिप्रेजेंटेशन होना चाहिए और ऐसे देश शामिल होना चाहिए इन संगठनों में जिससे प्रभाव पड़े, जिससे फ़र्क हो और जिससे वर्ल्ड गवर्नेंस जो है बेहतर रहे. और ब्रिक्स में भी मेरे ख्याल से काफ़ी मतलब हमारे जो पार्टनर्स हैं वो सहमत हैं कि यूएन सिक्योरिटी काउंसिल बढ़ना चाहिए. ज़रूर नुआंसेस में कुछ अंतर होंगे, कुछ विवाद होंगे, पर ख़ास तौर से जनरली आप अगर देखें तो इसके लिए ज़रूर सपोर्ट है अंतर्राष्ट्रीय कम्युनिटी से.
ग्लोबल साउथ की चर्चा करते हैं अभी हम. अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर भारत ग्लोबल साउथ की आवाज़ बनते जा रहा है. जब ये ग्लोबल साउथ फ्रेज़ बना तो किस कंट्रीज़ को ध्यान में रख करके बनाया गया था, और 125 कंट्रीज़ जो बताया जा रहा है उसके हिस्सा हैं, तो आपको क्या लगता है कि ये सबका साथ सबका विकास जो हिंदुस्तान का मॉडल है वही अब अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर है?
नहीं, बिल्कुल. जब हम ग्लोबल साउथ कहते हैं तो जितने भी विकासशील देश हैं, और आपने 125 देशों की बात किया, तो ये ग्लोबल साउथ के प्रतिनिधि हैं और इनके साथ हमारी एक बड़ा अच्छा संपर्क हुआ जब हमने वॉइस ऑफ ग्लोबल साउथ समिट ऑर्गेनाइज़ किया था. और ये हमारी G20 अध्यक्षता से पहले हमने किया ताकि इनको हम कंसल्ट करें, इनके विचार हम कंसिडर करें और इनके जो एक्सपेक्टेशंस हैं हमारी प्रेसिडेंसी की वो भी हम मतलब फैक्टर इन करें जब हम हमारे ब्रॉड प्रायोरिटीज़ और हमारे G20 पार्टनर्स के साथ हम एंगेज करेंगे. तो और ये टर्म ग्लोबल साउथ ब्रॉडली डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज़ को ही मतलब डिनोट करते हैं. और इसमें हमने देखा है कि ग्लोबल साउथ में काफ़ी मतलब कंसर्न्स हैं कि आज यूक्रेन कॉन्फ्लिक्ट चल रही है, आज इंटरनेशनल कम्युनिटी जो मेन कंट्रीज़ हैं उनका काफ़ी प्रीऑक्यूपेशन किसी और मतलब डायरेक्शन पे है, और इनके जो कंसर्न्स हैं जैसे फूड सिक्योरिटी कंसर्न्स है, एनर्जी सिक्योरिटी कंसर्न्स है, इन्फ्लेशन के कंसर्न्स है, तो इसके बारे में कोई मतलब ये इनका महसूस हो रहा है कि ये एरियाज़ में थोड़ा सा नेग्लेक्ट हुआ है। तो इसमें वो काफ़ी मतलब भारत के ओर देखते हैं कि जब भारत ने अध्यक्षता ली है G20 के, तो G20 एक बॉडी होना चाहिए जिस पे ये जो डिसीशंस हैं कि हम कैसे डील करेंगे ये मुद्दों से, ये डिसीशंस लिया जाए, निर्णय लिया जाए आउटकम ये समिट के टाइम पे।
तो आपने पॉइंट्स ऑफ कन्वर्जेंसेस की बात की, जैसे फूड सिक्योरिटी, एनर्जी सिक्योरिटी। क्या ये मुद्दे जो भारत सोचता है बाकी देशों के उनके इंटरेस्ट्स में है, were they the center stage? Were you able to put spotlight on them?
So I think all of our discussions in the G20 so far have been exactly on these issues. You know, when you talk about energy security, there's an energy working group that has looked into that. When you talk about food security, then there's an agricultural working group. In fact, अगर आप देखें तो हमारे जो महर्षि इनिशिएटिव्स हैं, millets and other ancient grains, तो आज जब क्लाइमेट चेंज की समस्या हो रही है, when there is an entire issue of climate change, people are looking for a superfood. But we have had this superfood for centuries. You know, we have been consuming millets, other countries have been consuming millets. Millets is a climate-resistant crop. It doesn't need fertilizer or pesticides. It is highly nutritious. And today, this is a crop that we are introducing to the world. 2023 is the International Year of the Millets. And we have said that the Maharishi campaign, which I think the G20 has endorsed, should be worldwide. We should be looking at solutions to climate change in ways that are unique, ways that go beyond the normal climate action-oriented measures. And I think we have been quite successful. Take lifestyle for environment. You know, the Prime Minister's vision that it should not just be climate actions. It should also be a people-oriented movement. What we are saying is that the world is living far beyond its sustainable levels. The UN Secretary General, when he came to India, said we are living at 1.6 times the level in which we can sustain, a sort of life normally on Earth. And in that context, we have said that there should be sustainable consumption. So lifestyle for environment means every person on this planet, and we have talked about pro-planet people, should be involved in an effort to conserve, to the extent possible, scarce resources of the Earth. So whether it's waste to wealth, whether it's the circular economy, these are all parts of the larger concept of a lifestyle for environment. Again, when you talk about lifestyle for sustainable development, this is what the G20 is also very happy to.
And there were several department-specific events, education ministers, agriculture minister, energy security events that were organized. And so let's come to the scalability of this entire event that was held for 10 months, and it will continue, and of course it will be culminating in 2 weeks from now. 56 cities, and from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, many cities you would have traveled for the first time perhaps, Mr. Shringla. Would you say that India has been an outstanding host, Vasudev Kutumbakam, and you would have sent that message to other countries as well? And what makes India, it was like the tourism experience, traveling to each and every part of India. The world saw India differently. And how has this been different from how other countries have had their G20 year?
So when we take on a presidency like the G20, and this is the first time we've been president of the G20, so it's an opportunity for us. How do we use this opportunity? First and foremost, I think we try to place our narrative on the global agenda. As a diplomat for a number of decades, all I've done is respond to the initiatives taken by others. Today, we are taking initiatives, whether it's the International Day of Yoga, International Day of Millets, whether you talk about any initiative in the world, a lot of those initiatives come from India. So if you talk about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which also I think is a concept that increasingly is getting traction, is basically working for the global common good, working for the interests of humanity. And from that point of view, we are also looking, in terms of what we can do, Atiti Devo Bhava, welcome your guests, show them your cultural heritage, your cultural diversity, your tourism potential, And if you look at the vision of the Prime Minister, he, in the beginning we said, let's do it in 13 cities, because that is as far as our mind could stretch. But he said, no, let us do it in every state and union territory of India. And today, I think we will have completed 200 meetings in about 60 cities. I mean, by the time we finish our presidency, we would have completed that record. 60 cities of India have hosted G20 meetings. I think no other country in the G20 has even come close to that record. And what we have done really is taken the G20 to every corner of our country. Every small city and town of our country has welcomed the G20. And as such, we have democratized the G20. Through a Jan Bhagidari mode, we have taken the G20 to the grassroots levels. So every citizen of India today has been a stakeholder and a partner in our G20 process. It is not a remote exercise in the capital, New Delhi. It has involved people across our country. And people have come forward in every way, whether it's the Youth 20, whether it is Women's 20, whether it is Think 20, it's Civil 20. Lakhs and lakhs of our people have come together to support the G20 process. So I think this has made, the democratization of the G20 has made it, as has been said earlier, a people's G20, has popularized it. And today I think it is, if you look at our logo, initially we tried to say that, you can use the logo, and we were very selective. But everybody now uses the logo, right from shopping malls to auto rickshaw drivers. It's ubiquitous, it's all over the country. There are multinational companies coming to us and saying, can we use your logo? And you talked about Srinagar. I was there when an international media person asked me, he says, how much are you paying these companies to use your logo? So we said it's the other way around. Companies should be paying us to use our logo. It is that popular. But yes, we have taken it to Srinagar, we have taken it to Itanagar, we have taken it to, Lakshadweep, Diu, and we have taken the G20 to places.
And which are the cities that you traveled, because you have been a career diplomat, where you had not been in the past? And in terms of local economy, the transformation that it saw, the push that it received, besides beautification and the infrastructure push that we saw all over the country?
So everywhere you've taken the G20 to, I think there has been a very, very interesting phenomenon. States have come forward, municipalities have come forward, local organizations have come forward and have said, let's present our best face. And as a result, wherever we've taken the G20, we've found a lot of investments in urban infrastructure and urban transformations. If you go to Jodhpur, they've made huge changes in the city. They've, widened pavements, made roads better, built better structures. I'm just giving an example. If you go to Bangalore, you will see the same thing. You go to smaller cities and towns all over the country, including my part of the country, which is Darjeeling and Siliguri. You've seen changes that the states have brought about. You've seen changes that the municipality has brought about. And these changes will go beyond the G20. So if we can take the G20 to places, and it has a lasting impact on cities and towns across India, especially the smaller ones. Cities are competing to be the cleanest city, the best city, the most, I would say, efficient city, and so on and so forth. Srinagar, for example, the Smart Cities program coincided with the G20, and that city was transformed. People are absolutely amazed at what Srinagar looks like. That walk along the Jhelum, the Dal Lake, etc., has been completely, changed and improved. And I think as a result, there was a lot of local support, a lot of local traction, saying that why don't you get more events like the G20? The other thing is that many of these cities have never hosted an international event, ever. So you host an international event like the G20, you have about 200 delegates that come from all over the world, a couple of hundred media people. These cities are encouraged because they've expanded capacity, they're confident, they can now host not only international conferences, they can host commercial conferences, they can host MICE events. And I think this is the difference that it has made, which will, I think the resonance of this will go far beyond our G20 presence.
And we have Youth 20 and Women 20 also in the audience who will be asking some questions to you. So let's open the floor for some questions now. Will the mic be moved, please? Yes, please. Go ahead.
As India have the G20 presidency for the first time, so in the same regard, what is the current status of India as a G20 leader, and what are the future possibilities to continue this leadership?
Basically, how do you continue with the momentum?
Yes. So G20 is, I think, a unique opportunity, and we undoubtedly will have many more opportunities. You see, if you look at the month of December 2022, India was in the position where we were president of 3 international bodies. We were president of the UN Security Council, we were president of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which you mentioned, and we were also president of G20. And in a certain sense, you've got the feeling that we have come onto the global high table. And I'm sure that given our leadership that we have exemplified through our own examples and our own best practices, there will be many other opportunities to lead through example, and to lead especially those countries that want to see change for the better, for more development.
More questions? Yes, please.
Hello, sir. My name is Ishika Sharma. So, sir, my question is, may you please enlighten us that how India is becoming a voice for smaller nations through its G20 presidency?
Okay, let's combine that with another question. Yes, please. Go ahead. Pass on the mic.
Hello, sir. My name is Surbit Gehlot, and I'm from Bennett University. My question to you is, as one of the agenda of India is the multilateral institutions for the 21st century. So what do you mean by that, and why do you think that we need all these organizations?
So, I mean, I think the two questions are interlinked in a sense that, multilateral institutions have an important impact on the developing world because they have the ability to really make a difference. But today we are saying that these multilateral institutions that have been created in the aftermath of the Second World War, whether it's the United Nations or the Bretton Woods institutions, haven't really come up to the expectations of the world, especially the developing world. And what can we do to change that? And that is where the first question is relevant, is that India is perceived to be the voice of the global south. And we need to factor in, I mean, we ourselves are a developing country, but we have shown through example, I mean, if you take the Jandan Aadhaar, we have shown that we can have 1 billion Aadhaar cards, we can provide bank accounts to 480 million people, we can have the cheapest internet telephony rates in the world, and thereby empower our people through direct benefits transfers. What can we do to help those 3 billion people who don't have identity cards in the world, 1 billion people who don't have bank accounts in the world? How can we help them? And so while the voice of the global south is articulation, we take it to the UN, we take it to the G20, we take it to BRICS. If you saw the PM's message in the BRICS, it was human-centric globalization. That is where we represent the interests of the developing world, which I think today is appreciated across the board. But we also demonstrated through example. India has called for the African Union to be a permanent invitee to the G20. And we have done that because we believe that Africa and countries in the global south should have better representation, whether it's the G20, it's the Security Council, it's any organization that is international and involves international governance, so that you are more effective when you are better represented. And of course, we also want to make that difference through example. In other words, how can we help Africa? We have so many schemes, e-Arogya, e-Vidya Bharati, many schemes that help Africa, many projects, including lines of credit that develop infrastructure, that develop those countries as per their priorities. I mean, we are one country that has never said, we will give you this, this is what you need, and these are the conditions under which we will give you this. We have always said that, what do you want, and how can we help you? And that has been our approach. And so it is not a recent approach, it is an approach that has always existed, but what we have done in recent years is to make it more effective. We have certainly made our foreign policy oriented towards working for the global common good, whether it's in COVID, where we gave medicines to over 190 countries, whether through Vaccine Maitri, we shared our limited vaccines with countries across the world. We have demonstrated that we have the potential and the willingness to help countries, the developing countries across the world. So we are not just a voice, we are more than a voice, we are also a practical example of what developing countries can do to help themselves, and of course articulate it through bodies and organizations in which we have a leadership position.
Let's take some more questions. Yes, please, ma'am, go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Please elaborate a little more about how Kashmiri people have taken this, because the young generation, this is the first time they are seeing something like this happening in their city. So, Some anecdotes also if you have to share.
So that's a very interesting question because I went at least 2 or 3 times, to prepare for that G20 meeting in Srinagar. And what we definitely wanted was that there is a certain amount of not just organization in the meeting that we will host, but also support of the administration, the Union Territory in organizing the meeting. And as I said, I think it was very coincidental that we had, we accelerated the existing urban transformation programs, including the Smart Cities program. When I went 6 months earlier, there was a lot to be done. But when we went for the actual meeting there, what I found was that there was a world of difference. The city had been completely transformed. And I think beautified, improved, but improved in ways that are long-lasting, not just cosmetic improvements. The people, my sense was, because I tried to move around as much as possible in Srinagar myself. I went on the Jhelum walk, I went on the Dal, we went to various parts of Srinagar. And I also talked to people across the board. And what I found was that people said, look, we've never had this sort of international event. That you could bring 200 foreign delegates and have a tourism meeting. That means the top world tourism officials come down to Srinagar, come down to Jammu and Kashmir. People could never imagine that's possible. And it was conducted in an atmosphere of complete peace and tranquility. There was not a single demonstration, not a single incident in that period of time. And I'll tell you why that was. Because people believed that this was in their own interest. People were supportive of that G20 process. And the one thing we heard from a lot of people was, please do more of these international events. We need this sort of attention. We need this sort of support. And I think if you look at the Sher-e-Kashmir Convention Center, it's a very nice one, completely upgraded for the G20. They can host international meetings of a similar nature. I mean, they have the confidence now, they have the ability to do it. And I'm sure you will see much more. As the train reaches Srinagar, as the highway, the highway connecting Jammu and Srinagar becomes operational by this year, we already had about 2 crore tourists that were expected this year. And many more have come. I think the Lieutenant Governor made a statement that because of G20, many more tourists have come. The number of foreign tourists have increased enormously. And I was asked very often there by the media, they said, many of the embassies have put out advisories that you should not visit Srinagar. And my point was that if you see around us, you're seeing representatives of all these countries. The top officials of all these countries are here. We also have a lot of foreign tourists coming in. And none of them have experienced any issue because everybody in Jammu and Kashmir believes that tourism is in their own interest. There is a percolation of wealth down to the grassroots level. The chap making, a piece of handicrafts which is bought by tourists is benefiting. The person at the absolute bottom rung of that socioeconomic ladder is also benefiting. So there is benefit across the board. And I think this is what G20 has done. Srinagar is a very, very good example, but across the board, whether it's the northeast, whether it is, in the south, west, you have actually stimulated, your own handicrafts, your own craftspeople, your own cultural people, your own cuisines, and popularized them across the world and given confidence to our citizens across the country. And I think this is really what matters. But Srinagar, for me, is always... somehow I feel very attached to that one meeting because we have spent so much effort in making that meeting a success. And the fact that our delegates have gone back and said that this is the best meeting we have had, this is the best exposure we have had, I think gave us a lot of satisfaction.
Okay, so we have really come to the end of this discussion. Ma'am, you want to have a quick question, please, 30 seconds.
I'm Dr. Nidhi Jha, I'm a gynecologist. I just want to ask, what do we have for healthcare sector being president of G20?
So healthcare, there is a lot of global interest because after COVID, everybody wants to work together to promote global cooperation in healthcare. One of the most important things is that how do we respond to emergencies in the future? If you have another pandemic of that nature that we just experienced, how does the global community come together? So there is a decision to establish a mechanism whereby countries can cooperate more effectively. There is, of course, digital health. We have led by example, Arogya Setu or Co-Win platform through which we administered over 2 crore vaccines to our people. All of these examples are those that we can use, and we have used in the health sector in the G20. So I think that is an area of success, and where I think everybody was keen to cooperate and get the results.
So my last question, G20 finance ministers meet failed to agree on a joint statement. How optimistic or positive are you for when the heads of state meet?
I would put it somewhat differently. I think they succeeded in getting an outcome that everybody agreed to. Every paragraph in that statement had been approved by consensus by all delegates in that meeting, except one which pertained to a geopolitical issue over which I think there is still, as I said, vivad abhi bhi hai in between nations that are there. That will take some time to resolve, but otherwise, everybody believes that the reason that we are there in the G20 is larger than just our country's interest. It is a global interest. And if we don't succeed, if the G20 doesn't succeed, we don't succeed. There's a very clear sense. So I think everybody wants to collaborate. Everybody wants to work together to make the G20 a success, not for themselves, but for the entire world, in keeping with Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Very much for joining us on the NDTV Conclave. It was a pleasure having you among us. And one thought that has been echoed clearly throughout the day repeatedly, but it can't be said enough, is that the G20 meeting that India will host will shape the decisions that the most powerful 20 countries will make over the next few years. And for India, it will shape our global future. Now, for instance, these meetings come at a time when India is at a critical juncture at the global stage. The government is trying to balance its ties with various allies, given that the government's stand on Russia, the government's stand on import and export restrictions have raised eyebrows with even some of its closest allies. So to discuss how the G20 defines India's global future and the challenges ahead for India's emergence as a global power, I welcome on stage Meera Shankar, the former ambassador of India to the United States, Mr. Ashok Malik, the partner and chair at the Asia Group, and Mr. C. Rajamohan, a senior fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. In conversation with them is NDTV's editorial head, Special Projects, Gargi Rawat.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session, and welcome to all my panelists today. And we're going to talk about India's global moment at the G20. India's presidency right now comes at a very, key time in the world, given the geopolitical situation, various tensions, U.S., Russia, U.S., China, India, good friends with Russia, India's tensions with China. You've just had the BRIC summit, which has been fairly successful, this push of the global south. So given all these, what's happening across the world and these geopolitical tensions, how easy or difficult is it for India to navigate these somewhat choppy waters? Ambassador, first to you.
Well, I think it's a very, very difficult time for the world, because on the one hand, you have all these challenges which have been exacerbating and which don't respect boundaries and require international cooperation. Climate change, pandemics, the global economy, indebtedness of poor countries. These are all issues which don't respect national borders and require a global solution. And on the other hand, you have a global situation which makes cooperation far more difficult than it has been in the past. When the G20 was first set up, or at least I should say first raised to summit level in the wake of the 2008 global financial and economic crisis, it was able to achieve success in stabilizing the economic situation globally and in creating a regulatory framework which would reduce the risk of repetition of such events. And everybody bought into it, including having a coordinated global economic stimulus, signing on to the tighter regulatory frameworks for banks. But then that was at a time when the relationship between the great powers was far less competitive and even hostile than it is today. Today, we see that the strategic competition between the US and Russia, it's a proxy conflict,
right.
Has erupted into real conflict. We see the same in terms of the strategic competition between the US and China. That makes actual global cooperation far more difficult. And therefore, India's task has been a very delicate one to navigate through these choppy waters. I think the other element I would like to emphasize is that at the time that G20 was set up, it was still kind of the heyday of globalization. Free trade, free movement of goods and services. Now what we are seeing is a far more nationalistic economic approach from most countries, and protectionism even in those countries which had been the advocates of unimpeded trade and investment, such as the US or in Western Europe, whether it be on the question of protecting their industries, buying American or others. There is a kind of protectionism which has taken hold, and more nationalistic industrial and economic policy. So you have these two things, sharpening geostrategic and geopolitical competition. I would also say geotechnological competition between the US and China, and at the same time, far more restrictive economic policies, less welcoming of free trade. So in this situation, I think India has had a very difficult, unenviable task of trying to forge a consensus, but it has taken the issues head on and tried to at least shape the agenda and move the needle forward on many of these issues. Now, most of these issues are not such that they are, that they enable immediate solutions. I think if you're looking at climate change, it will require action going up to 2050. So what we can do is to accelerate the process, maybe move the needle forward, and that is what we have tried to do.
All right, Ashok, Malik, your views on this. And India's done a lot of fine balancing in these last few years when it comes to, our long-standing friendship with Russia, our friendship with the US just now, given the Prime Minister's trip, with Iran as well. Iran thanked India after the expansion of BRICS and its inclusion. So a lot of fine balancing when it comes to our foreign policy. And now with the G20 presidency, how do you see that?
Every G20 summit or conference or presidency takes place in a particular context. The G20 began really as a response to the global financial crisis of 2008, and it was 20 large countries coming together as a global financial management, cabinet or cohort, if you will. If you look at the context of the Indian presidency, it is very different. Every decade in foreign policy gives you one or two shocks. The 2020s have given you 3 shocks already. The COVID shock, the Ukraine war, and the clear geopolitical divide between the US and China, which is forcing many countries to choose. In fact, it's forcing all countries to make some sort of a choice. So 3 shocks in 3 years or 4 years means that this presidency has a very troubled and a very complex agenda. These shocks have led to multiple implications. One, of course, is insufficient bandwidth and resourcing for climate change and climate finance. Second, there is a commodities crisis, particularly a food and energy crisis. There's simply not enough food and energy for all the people of the world. And we're seeing that over the past 2 or 3 years. A third, in terms of sensitive technologies, critical and emerging technologies, countries are being forced to make choices and come to political compromises. Economic choices are being affected by politics. And finally, of course, there's one window of hope, which is everyone's betting on digital public infrastructure, and everyone wants to get onto that train as quickly as possible. The battle really is for the hearts and minds of the global south. The countries that are not part of the G20, that are not rich countries, that are not very developed countries or emerging economies of a significant nature, but countries that are facing the brunt of the 3 shocks of this decade. And I think what India's presidency has done is bring the global south and its concerns right to the heart of the G20. In some senses, this is the second of 4 successive developing country presidencies. Indonesia last year, India this year, then you have Brazil and South Africa. And the character of G20 is being defined by this presidency and the presidencies around it. From a pure financial management model, it is becoming more of a developmental model, a developmental agenda. India can take some credit for that transition.
All right. I also want to talk about the G20 being spread across, as we've seen in the build-up, across 200 cities. There have been a lot of questions and interest regarding that. And in the previous session, we talked about Srinagar at length. But what do you think this has achieved when it comes to foreign policy specifically?
I think one thing I notice is how much interest in the Indian population is there today on foreign policy. That foreign policy is no longer an elite activity, which has historically been just diplomats in pinstripes. I mean, with apologies to Ambassador Shankar, that to one where actually there is much greater interest today, because India itself has globalized, that it is connected far more deeply to the world. For example, in a $3.5 trillion GDP, we have almost $1.3 trillion of trade. So India has never been as connected. Indian students travel, Indians are traveling for tourism. So it's really an India that's connected. So I think one of the things this government has done is really to take advantage of that and take foreign policy activity to the people, to different corners of the country. In the past too, we used to do occasional conferences outside Delhi. But in this case, we've seen last 10 years, I mean, frequent attempts at taking multilateral meetings outside, bilateral meetings outside. For example, when the Japanese Prime Minister came, Mr. Modi went to Varanasi, in Ahmedabad, in Goa, in various places we've seen foreign policy activity come. I think what the G20 has done is really to take it to a new level of engagement with the Indian public. And I think from what we've seen, really, there's a lot of positive response to it. So the challenge would be to build on this further, that how do we mobilize the popular interest in actually giving greater support for India's engagement with the world.
Right. Ambassador Shankar, something you'd like to add to this, taking it to 200 cities, interest in the Indian population, but also when it comes to foreign policy and having all these delegates travel to other cities, what has it meant for the G20?
Well, I think it makes foreign policy live, if I may say so. Otherwise, it's an issue which is dealt with, as Rajmohan said, by people in pinstripes, but to that I'd like to add women in saris too.
Of course.
And because it's no longer a man's world only. It's made people aware that foreign financing impinges on their day-to-day lives. For instance, if we are able to get more financing, climate financing, which will enable our energy transition to renewable energies or cleaner energies such as hydrogen in a more affordable, more sustainable manner without some of the risks which might currently be associated with it, I think that would impact the daily lives of people, because people are not aware in India that foreign policy impacts their daily lives. What we negotiate and concede, say for instance at the WTO in agriculture, will impact on every farmer in India, what we negotiate in terms of free trade pacts, I think again impacts sometimes adversely on our small and medium industries, and we have to be very conscious of that when we negotiate, that we don't only negotiate for the moment or a photo opportunity, but that we keep in mind the long-term impact that this will have on the future of the country. And I think what this does is to make this alive to people in different parts of the country.
All right. Ashok Malik, you both were talking about the context, the relevance of the G20, the situation in which it came around originally. And it's very interesting because, coming up to this year, our presidency, you see a multipolar world order sort of emerging in a sense. And there's, so much talk on that, so much is happening on that. So on that front, how is India poised?
It's a very confused world order. It's not there's no clarity about it being either a bipolar world or a multipolar world. There are two very
efforts on
there are two very significant powers in the world which have a near global bandwidth, the US and to a lesser degree China. And then there are a number of other powers which matter a great deal, and especially in their regions. So in the Indo-Pacific, certainly India is an important power. You could call it a pole, you could call it a sub-pole. I don't think we have the terminology for it yet, but it is a significant power. But I do believe that in different themes, on different areas of endeavor, on the international stage, in the global economy, in global politics, different countries matter in different ways. So I think if you look at the way the global order developed after the Second World War, there was a lot of institution building in the Euro-Atlantic region, in the region between the United States and Europe, because that's the region that saw two great wars in a generation. The desire to rebuild Europe, to build peace, permanent peace in Europe and the Euro-Atlantic region led to a great institution building endeavor there. That process is just about beginning in the Indo-Pacific. And the Indo-Pacific has now replaced the Euro-Atlantic, in a sense, as the locus of the global economy. So we're still at the very early stage of it. The G20 is one response, the Quad is another response, AUKUS is a third response. There will be multiple responses. I don't think we are at a multipolar world yet, or even at a proper bipolar world. But by the end of this decade, perhaps, we'll have a clearer answer. And this is going to be a very defining and transformative decade for the global system.
All right. A joint statement could not be agreed on. We do have an outcome statement. And this is not just this year, even the previous year, that this was a challenge. And so what are our expectations from the summit now?
Look, I think, as we said, there are two big problems in the world today. The great powers are at each other's throats. There's a real war happening in the heart of Europe. And second, the economic order, that the globalization structure that we were familiar with for the last 3 decades is breaking down. So on core issues, that there is no agreement. And it's quite clear that we're not going to bridge that very easily. I think that's why the G20 is particularly challenging. I think what I see today is what India has done in the last few months is really to create a range of other areas where agreement can be produced. That is from digital public infrastructure or on trade facilitation. In fact, even yesterday, the trade ministers had agreed on a few things. So I think by pushing on so many diverse fronts and to at least get some agreements where there are possible, because on the two basic issues, there's not much agreement, but there's a lot of agreement on other issues. The trick and the success would be if we can still manage to get a joint statement where, like in Bali, yes, where diplomats are paid to do this, but there's ways in which language can be crafted, the difficult parts can be moved to a footnote, countries that they don't like can be dissociate themselves with an asterisk. So there are possibilities. I think I'm still 50-50. I would think there's a reasonable chance still you could come up with a document that might still be able to, everyone could sign and live with. And I think that's the story for the next few days, that the trade ministers meeting, I think, seem to give us some hope. But I would say when the foreign ministers come, before the leaders themselves meet, so there is room here for quite a bit of diplomacy in the next few days.
All right. Ambassador Shankar, also the war in Ukraine has brought focus on food security, and already after COVID, supply chains have been in focus. So for India, this is both a challenge and an opportunity?
Yes, but I would say more the realization. I think, on food security, we have to work much harder to look long-term, and I think Mr. Shringla referred to it, yes. To adapt agriculture for coming climate change. And here crops like millets will play a very important role because they are so hardy. They can grow in semi-arid conditions. They don't require much water, and they can withstand extremes of heat. So this kind of transformational shift in agriculture is something which India is seeking to propel, and I think that is going to be an opportunity and very forward-looking. But at the same time, I would say the realization that over-dependence on one country during the pandemic had led to disruption of supply chains and shortages of essential commodities across the globe. And even now, the dominance of single countries in areas such as critical minerals or rare earths and things which are all going to be required by all countries if we are to make the transformative transitions on energy and technology which we need to make for climate change, then we have to look at establishing diversified supply chains and strengthening their resilience. And I think in that lies an opportunity for India, because India has the possibility with its technological capabilities to emerge as one of the countries in that diversified supply chain. As of now, we are seeing only the beginnings, the incipient beginnings with Apple and Foxconn doing part of their manufacturing in India, and now the decision of Micron to have a final packaging plant for semiconductors in India. But I think we can accelerate this, and we should try in every way to do so, because much of the investment has been flowing to Southeast Asia, to Vietnam or Mexico. Not so much has come to India. And it means we as a country need to do more to get that here and to establish that ecosystem.
All right. Ashok Malik, on the issue of climate change, India's position, it being able to champion underdeveloped countries when it comes to negotiating with the West, and this is a big role that India has been playing and will and can continue to play when it comes to negotiations on this.
The key issue on climate change, since many major countries have already set their net zero target years, the key issue is climate finance. Who pays and how smoothly do capital flows...
Something that India's been pushing at every forum.
How smoothly does capital flow towards projects, which in the end will deliver both economic returns as well as returns for the planet. But which are projects which are located in countries that are far away from where the money is currently lying. So whether it's energy transition, whether it's climate adaptation, whether it's resilient infrastructure, you need investment for these for products that are available in the capital markets, but products that are underserved by the current amount of investment. And the key issue really is, if I'm an investor or an equity fund sitting in Canada or the US, am I happy with small, modest, but guaranteed returns at home? Or am I willing to take a bet and invest in projects in maybe Asia, where the need is much more for climate finance, where the returns will be much larger, but where I am inhibited because I'm simply ignorant about that market. And that is a constant tussle, really, between inhibition and removing that inhibition. I think India's brought that issue to the table in a big way, but obviously much work remains to be done.
Right, and in the past we used to see India and China, coming together on this, but of late not so much. It's been India and the other countries, India championing the cause, China is also there. Talking about India-China relations and the various issues and especially coming together on climate change. But what we saw in BRICS just now, there was a conversation between Prime Minister Modi, Xi Jinping. There was a little quibbling on how that came about. Your views on that?
Look, I think the China issue, I fear, might actually overshadow the G20 summit. I mean, that we saw in BRICS. See, once you have the media interest immediately, this complex, details of a multilateral world, to saying, will they meet or will they not meet? If they met, was it a conversation? Was it a meeting? Was it a pull aside? So I think seemingly there was some guidance from the two leaders to move forward on the boundary dispute. So we still don't have the final word, whether Mr. Xi Jinping will actually come. So if he comes, and the last few weeks, there have been intense negotiations on the boundary issue by our military commanders. So if there is progress in the next few days, then I think in India-China confrontation easing would be big news, but it'll also, I think, create a good atmosphere for the larger dynamic in the G20 summit. But then this has been going on for 70 years. I mean, you have to be utterly optimistic to believe breakthroughs can happen in 2 meetings. It's a very complex dispute. It's a very difficult dispute. So I wouldn't raise hopes, but I think something seems to be cooking at this point.
Ambassador Shankar?
On the same issue? Well, I think that, China has adopted a far more assertive and sometimes even aggressive approach on boundary issues with its neighbors, whether it is the maritime boundary in the East China Sea, South China Sea, or the land boundary with India. And their policy basically says that China must establish its sovereignty over every inch of disputed territory, which obviously sets it up for conflict, because these are areas where there are conflicting claims. And if the issue is to be settled on the basis of force and on the basis of one side's claims, then that doesn't leave room for a meeting ground. But we have to see whether, the efforts at negotiating de-escalation and disengagement, troop withdrawals, military infrastructure removals from the confrontation on the border in the Depsang and Demchok areas is successful. And then there's the larger question of the boundary itself and confidence-building measures on the line of control. Because the confidence-building measures on the line of control had held the peace for 20 years, even though the line was undefined and remains undefined even now. The question is, with Chinese actions, these CBMs were shattered. And now the question is, how do we restore that trust? How do we build new confidence-building measures? Or how do we settle the boundary? How do we settle the LAC? These are much larger questions which will remain open for much longer, I'm afraid. At best, at the present juncture, you might see intensified efforts to local de-escalation and disengagement and de-escalation.
And what Raja Mohan felt that could this overshadow what we're watching at the G20 summit, or what is your view on that?
No, well, obviously, if
I know we, the media, are always like very interested, and the questions and speculations continue.
Every SAARC meeting would be overtaken by the Pakistani and Indian Prime Minister's meeting. I guess this one will, to some degree, be hijacked by what the Indian and Chinese leaders say to each other. I think it was always on the cards that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi would interact in some form before G20 to, if nothing else, smoothen the pathway to President Xi's participation, possible participation. So I was not really surprised that they interacted
in South Africa.
In South Africa. But as Ambassador Shankar said, to suggest that this can automatically lead to a very complex border situation being smoothened and resolved, perhaps you could see some tactical disengagement from a couple of locations, but a broader de-escalation, I don't think that's happening in a hurry. Also, quite honestly, even if there is a de-escalation, even if China says we'll go back to those 4 border agreements they tore up in the last few years, I think Indian strategy has also evolved. The Indian mood has evolved. The public mood has evolved, which is also an important determinant in a democracy. So both countries have moved on significantly since March 2020 or April 2020. I don't think the India-China issue can be brought back to where
and
it once was.
that little quibbling that took place post talks,
I think
how it came about, India had one version, Chinese officials.
Both countries will have their...
Does this always create a little like aftertaste? Yes.
Have you seen The Great Dictator with Charlie Chaplin, where you have Hitler and Mussolini in chairs and each one trying to be a little higher than the other?
It's a bit of that.
So I think you're seeing a little bit of that from the Chinese side.
All right, well, let's move away from that. Talking about all these new groupings that we now have, and there are various cliques and groupings, and there's Quad and there's BRICS, there's expanded BRICS. Now, does this create more confusion?
I wouldn't use the word cliques. That's a Chinese word these days. So the Chinese say, look, when they sit with the Russians, that is not a clique, but when India sits with the Americans, it becomes a clique. So I think the Chinese attempt at presenting their views as global views, I think there is a backlash to it in Asia. They might do very well in Africa, where they're far away. But if you look at what's happened in Asia in the last 1 year, I mean, you have Japan and South Korea are almost like India, Pakistan. I mean, they have a huge historical problems. But today they've come together with the US to oppose China. So that's a trilateral that has emerged. There is the US, Japan, Australia, Philippines, because Philippines has been at the receiving end of Chinese bullying for almost 10 years. So finally, you have actually, they're standing up today. And then you have the AUKUS, which is Australia, US, UK, trying to develop nuclear submarines to deal with the Chinese maritime threat. And then you have the India in a Quad.
Yes.
And then we also have the I2U2, where India is part of, along with Israel, the United States, and the United Arab Emirates. So I think small groups were always there. It's not some new thing that has happened. It is when one country tries to dominate a region, there are 2 kinds of reactions. One, which is to create an alliance of the kind that NATO and others. But what we're seeing today is really forming overlapping networks which can limit a one power from unilaterally trying to change borders, like what China does here, what Russia has done in Europe, that the need to protect sovereignty, territorial integrity of states. If that is the aim, how do you produce that result? Through deterrence. So that's the reason why you have new groups that are emerging. And I think those will be there. And my sense is Chinese don't like it, but because they say, look, it is their word or, my way or highway kind of an attitude. But I think the rest of the world is simply not going to roll over and simply accept the Chinese claim. So people will form associations, people will form groups to deal with what they see as fundamental threats to their national security.
Okay, and I'll open it up also for more questions, but yes, to add
comment.
to that.
I just say that in a situation where the world is in flux and the old settled relationships are shifting, I think you're going to see what I call the variable geometry of international cooperation. It's not going to be set-piece groupings of known powers. It will be shifting and overlapping groupings, but the world will eventually either emerge as multipolar or it will emerge as bipolar. And this is a kind of transitional phase where you're going to see a lot of fluidity. And for India, it's important to retain flexibility.
I'd just like to point out to one thing here. There are old groupings, there are new groupings. Groupings will always be formed and reshaped in the international order, but the relative weight of groupings keeps changing. In that context, the decision by the US president not to go to meet the ASEAN countries and not to attend the East Asia Summit, which was really set up with American support many years ago. But to come to the G20 and to come to India's G20 sends a very significant message. And we should be alive to that.
Yes. All right, I'd like to open it up. Any questions? Yes, go ahead. If we can get a mic here. Do I give my mic? Uma, mic.
There's been so much talk about the G20, and recently President Putin has said that he won't be attending India's summit. So what do you reckon is the politics behind that? What would be your, from your experience, what would you consider is the rationale and the deeper workings guiding that decision?
I think he's under pressure because of Ukraine, but also anticipates that he will be under pressure from the Western Bloc were he to come. So on both counts, perhaps sometimes discretion is the better part of valor.
He didn't attend BRICS either. Yes, go ahead. Can we get the mic there?
Hello, everyone. There is a biggest player of climate finance existing in the market. So how will we beat that through G20 summits?
Sorry, I didn't hear you clearly.
I'm asking, there is a biggest player of climate finance existing in the market on global level. So how will we beat that through the G20 summits?
Climate financing.
Yeah.
Well, climate financing is an area where I think we are really falling short. But some innovative suggestions have been made in this presidency of the G20 by India. And while we have been demanding that the developed countries provide, financing, which is public financing, to help developing countries undertake mitigation and adaptation to climate change, it hasn't been forthcoming. Even the pledge of $100 billion made earlier has not been fulfilled. First COVID, then the war in Ukraine, then the faltering economies, and they say they are not in a position to give. So what has been suggested now is that we draw in the multilateral, A, the private sector, and B, the multilateral development institutions. Now, if we look at private financing for climate change, then it is not available in sufficient quantities. I think very little comes to the developing world. B, the costs of it are much higher than in the developed world because they see it as risky. So the risk, cost that you have to pay as developing countries for private capital for climate finance is very much higher. Right, so the suggestion is that the multilateral development banks or other institutions could provide an insurance cover or a guarantee to the private lenders, which would bring down their risk factor and therefore reduce the total cost of climate finance and make available more climate finance to the developing world. Of course, in addition, we would need subsidized public finance for various efforts, but this is a new suggestion and one worth considering, and I hope it remains on the agenda.
This has been the huge challenge always, this climate finance. One last question. Yes, young man there.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, sir. So this is Gaurang from Jagan Institute of Management Studies. My question to you is, how do you think this G20 presidency is going to affect the employability rate of India?
Big concern among the
very
youth.
quick
Ashok
question
Malik.
to you all.
All right, Ashok Malik, is something you'd like to answer?
I don't think G20 directly affects employment, but I think this G20 presidency takes place at a time of great shifts in the global economy, in global supply chains. And as Ambassador Shankar pointed out, we are moving from a 20 or 30-year era when there was great sourcing concentration on one geography, China really, to a more diversified manufacturing ecosystem, where India will not be the only beneficiary, far from it. Mexico, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam, of course, are also vying for the same supply chains. But India can, because of its size, because of its scale, can certainly host a very significant quantum of the global value chains. And those will create jobs, both first order direct jobs and second order indirect jobs. But that process perhaps would be accentuated by the fact that we're hosting the G20 and we're coming into the limelight. But that is a broader process, a broader endeavor for Indian foreign policy and economic management, which I think will play out through this decade.
Anything you'd like to add, Rajamohan, to that? I think the young people looking to see.
India is quite well placed because at a time when the rest of the world, there is general stagnation. Even China is slowing down. So my sense is India's opportunities have grown significantly in the last few years. I mean, earlier, Ambassador Meera Shankar talked about Apple, Foxconn, the demand for India's technical talent. And everywhere today, our government negotiates this migration and mobility agreements to run the new technology industries. So US, you already see it's mostly Indians doing so well. And I think the demand is now spreading to across the world. If you've done IT engineering, of course, you are top of the list. But my sense is most of the skills that are needed in this new age will be in great demand. And I think India's population profile, as well as the latent talent in this country, I think they're well placed to take advantage of a new international situation.
Let me just add here, I think that, you're seeing the world economy, the technology economy move towards digitization, and from digitization to artificial intelligence, and now space and quantum computing. There are a whole range of new breakthroughs which are on the horizon, beyond the horizon. And I think India has the possibility to scale up and master these technologies and to establish mutually beneficial collaborative arrangements with many of the developed countries, particularly the US, as we did with the IT sector, which grew on the back of linkages with the US economy. In that, we are helped by, say what the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called the new US policy of friend-shoring. That is, setting up offshore production or collaboration facilities in countries where they have mutual trust. I think that will benefit India. The big challenge is going to be not those who are highly qualified and can move up the value chain. The big challenge is going to be mass employment, because this is a factor all over the world, that new investments in manufacturing are now yielding fewer and fewer jobs with all the automation that is taking place. So it's a challenge not just for India, certainly very serious for India, but also for the world. And here we may have to look at much lower levels of manufacturing which provide mass employment and where we have been significantly weak. So like textiles, garments, leather, there are a range of areas which can provide agri-industries, which can provide mass employment. We have to also focus, along with the high-tech, we have to also focus on that.
All right, and that brings us to the end of this session. I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining us today on the Conclave and talking about all these issues, answering questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Panelists. Thanks very much, panelists, and thanks, Gargi, for moderating that discussion. Very important points made there ranging from economy, climate finance to interesting points made about how foreign policy directly impacts all of our lives, the lives of the common Indian every day. Now from this conversation, of course, we are sure that there are more conversations being triggered, more thoughts being triggered. So to enable those conversations and keeping with India's culture of conversations over tea, we'll pause for a short tea break now for 15 minutes. I request all of you to be back by 4 p.m. for our next few sessions. We have a power-packed session lined up with the top global voices. Along with that, we also have an exclusive interview coming up with the Power Minister, Mr. R.K. Singh. Please be back on time for those sessions. See you on the outside.
The climate crisis is a global problem. That's a fact. But it's only human and reasonable to wonder who's really to blame for it, who caused it, who should be pushed to actually solve it. My name is Anubha Bhosle and I'm dedicating this episode of The Climate Explainers to talk about climate equity or climate inequity. Now, these words get thrown around so very often by politicians, presidents, diplomats. Essentially, climate equity means fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of climate change. This episode is going to have a strong India and a global South focus. Now, global North and global South are, broadly speaking, terms used to describe economic and political divisions between countries. So, these
How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position. NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped
in how this money is going to be used? So Global South wants climate finance to support projects that promote sustainable development, for instance, that encourage low carbon technologies as the second. Now they want the money to deal with what are urgent climate impacts that they're already facing in their homes. But instead, a significant chunk of climate finance is earmarked for cutting down fossil fuel emissions, which developing countries say is the responsibility of developed countries first. Another important aspect is simply capacity building in these recipient countries. What do I mean when I say that? Well, many developing nations actually lack the necessary expertise and institutional frameworks to effectively utilize the climate finance that they get. So remember, just getting money is not enough. Technical assistance and knowledge transfer becomes extremely crucial to ensuring efficient implementation. If climate-related loans are not carefully managed, they could add to the burden of existing national debts, potentially hindering the country's economic growth and its overall stability. A recurring demand of the Global South is that they are owed these as grants and not loans, which need to be repaid. So, net-net, climate finance is critical for climate action and justice, but it often becomes intertwined with a lot more. Broader climate negotiations, all that politics, conflicting interests of the various stakeholders. I'm going to stop here. Think of this as a primer on climate finance. It is a far more broad-based and intersectional conversation. We definitely think it's time to have it. The team here at NDTV is prepping for many more episodes of the Climate Explainers, and we want to know what actually matters to you. So if you're watching this on TV, recommend us to a friend. And if you're accessing this on the NDTV website or any of the social platforms, just drop a comment. We're reading them all. Hi, today I'm talking about net zero.
Ladies and gentlemen, I request everybody to please gather in the hall as our next session is about to begin in just a short while. I request everybody to gather for the global voice of the I request everybody to gather for the Voice of the Global South session that we now have planned. All our guests have joined us, and I request all the people, all our guests in the audience to please gather, to please be seated so we can start the discussion. Already, I request all the members of the audience to please be seated so we can start the next panel discussion on India becoming the voice of the Global South. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to the Voice of the Global South session as a part of the NDTV Decoding G20 Conclave. Now, this tone for India becoming the voice of the Global South with the G20 presidency was set, or rather amplified, when the Voice of the Global South Summit was held in January this year, chaired by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. It was attended by 125 countries, including 18 heads of state and government level and others at ministerial levels. With the often skewed economics of development, the Global South is joining hands to get its voice heard and demand accountability from the North. How successful has it been, and what does the future hold? That's a pressing question. And to discuss that and more, please join me in welcoming our panelists, Mr. Borger Brender, the President of the World Economic Forum. We also have Mr. N.K. Singh, the co-convener of the G20 Independent Expert Group on Reforms in Multilateral Development Banks, and Vera Songwe, the Chair and Founder of Liquidity and Sustainability Facility at the Africa Growth Initiative of Brookings Institution. May I also invite NDTV's Executive Editor Vishnu Shore to kindly come on stage to have a conversation with our esteemed panelists.
Well, I'd like to welcome you all once again to this session. It's been extremely productive, and I think what we've been doing is just looking at the entire G20 process. It is also important to remember that B20, which represents the business end of the G20 process, is something which is being looked at very closely at this stage in Delhi. And I think as part of the B20 process, there are about 10 key processes that they're looking at to make the entire G20 agenda accessible and relevant to more than 1 billion plus around the world, certainly in the G20 grouping. We've got wonderful panelists with us today, representing a cross-section of interests. Let me come to you first, Mr. Singh, and ask you this question. One of the key issues that G20 is looking at is the issue of inclusion. It's key, of course, to India's economic growth, but it is also a G20 agenda. How?
Well, in multiple ways. First and foremost, that the digital story, which was rolled out in India with great alacrity, great success, is altering the architecture of governance. And the example of this altered architecture, of the empowerment which it has done in terms of gender empowerment, in terms of access to public services, in terms of the way in which the architecture of governance had hitherto been organized, being altered in fundamental, unrecognizable ways. That's one important takeaway from this G20. And I was in a session just now on exactly this very issue, which you have asked, and I'm sure that my colleague here, Veera, would like to add her own voice along with Borger on this very important question which you have raised.
In fact, let me go across to Mr. Brender first about digitalization. And we've discussed this earlier, you and I, but I think it's worth repeating. India's digitalization model, can it be replicated elsewhere, and if so, how?
First part of the question, yes. And second part of the question, hopefully. I think part of the reason why India now 3 years in a row has the fastest economic growth of any of the large economies is based on the digital ID where you started. 1.4 billion people have their digital ID. And if you look at India, the digitalization rate, people that have access to a cell digitally connected is just amazing. And if you look overall globally, it is close to 4 billion people that are not digitally connected with affordable prices. So this is a huge comparative advantage for India now moving forward. I just saw the other day on TV a grandmother, I think it was the state of Assam, sitting there with her cell and wiring money to the grandchildren on her own cell. Where else is that happening? And if India is 1.4 billion people digitally connected, and there are 4 billion people not digitally connected, you can just think of 7 billion people, you have a huge, huge advantage. That's why we urgently have to connect the 3.5 to 4 billion people that are not connected. That's a prerequisite for economic growth, it's a prerequisite for meeting the SDGs, and it's a prerequisite for poverty eradication.
And ma'am, it's also about, ultimately it's all about inclusion. We're talking about digitalization without necessarily having referred to what the end game is, and that is inclusion. It's inclusion of women, of men, of children. It's about ensuring basic fundamental rights. Therefore, when we talk about digitalization, what is it about digitalization that appeals most to you in the context of development?
No, thank you very much. I think 3 things. The first one is, as you said, inclusion. And Borge talked about the 3.5 billion people that are not included, most of them in the developing world. And so the question for me of financial inclusion is a macro and a micro issue. The first one is when you're not, if you're not financially inclusive, for those who are out of it, not having access to financial tools is a terrible thing. And poverty is a terrible thing. And we see that when we have crises, like the COVID crisis. The first thing that happens is the developing world cannot buy and cannot access COVID and COVID vaccines, right? And so essentially what you need is at that macro level to get inclusion right. Because you must get inclusion right at the macro level, which means global cost and access to financing. We cannot have spreads, credit spreads of sovereign bonds that are 10% different from emerging market economies and developed economies. You cannot have negative transfers going from the developed to the developing countries on the capital markets. So first of all, we must have equal or close to equal access to capital markets, which means developing our capital markets institutions. Secondly, and something that we talk about a lot, is local currency investment and growth. If you don't have that, then we are not really talking about the right kind of financial inclusion at that global level for investment. Now you come to the micro level, and what does that mean? When we talk about, and we have another word for talking about non-inclusion, which is essentially the informal economy. The conversation around the informal economy is really about non-inclusion, and I think that what India is doing with the Aadhaar program is really about including people, first of all, in the financial sector, and the minute you have enough information about them, they become formal. We can actually bring the SMEs in, we can grow them faster, and they can actually become then job-creating entities. And that is why you are the fastest growing economy in the world, because your Aadhaar economy is now paying off. People are joining the formal economy, people are employing others, and they're creating value. And I think if we don't have that globally, we cannot get the kind of growth that we need to get out of this crisis.
Yeah, and so just, and go ahead, but I wanted to ask you, just using 2 of the words that were referred to, inclusion and equal opportunity, 2 terms, one of the areas where India really prides itself and has a role is in medicine. We are called the pharmacy of the world, and the fact that during COVID we worked towards the inclusion of people around the world with our vaccines, it's something which can be replicated in the future as well. Is that an area, pharma and medicine, where you see India potentially having a lasting imprint within the G20 and outside? Mr. Singh.
Well, let me first add something to what Veera said, with which I fully agree, and thank you, Borge, for pointing out the huge implications this has for empowering a lot of people who are outside this digital framework. Let me say that from the macroeconomic perspective point of view, something, Veera, which you touched per se, digital access is also a growth disruptor. People are concerned with the enigma that given a lot of other disabilities, how is it that India is now the fastest growing economy of the world? This is because economic models do not work. When you introduce a disrupting factor, that disrupting factor is technology with a medium of digital access. So I think as we go forward, the world will learn the power increasingly from experiments of the kind which we are having on what it can do to disrupt the typology of growth and of growth projections, which is the basis on which all macroeconomic projections are made. So the power of the digital world and the conquest of the digital world is going to be growth supportive, a growth disruptor, as technology will break down earlier models and earlier calculus on which growth projections and linear programming was made.
Yeah. Would you like to take that question on India being the farmer of the world, the pharmaceutical sort of headquarters in a sense of the world? And therefore, when we're talking about inclusion, when we're talking about equal opportunity, what role does India have towards meeting the medical requirements of countless people?
So I think many are aware that India is the back office of the world. Is now increasingly also playing a role in manufacturing. But what many forget is on the pharmaceutical side, India is world leading. I think maybe 70 to 80% of all antibiotics that are produced globally come from this country. And this is a sector that also leads to the need for a lot of R&D and also investments. So I think India has a huge opportunity to go from manufacturing, also when it comes to pharmaceutical products, generic products, to also invest and be the developer and have the patents, and then you have the whole value chain. So I think this is another area where India has to go for the full value chain in the future, and to start with part of it also gives you insights where you can then leapfrog later on. And this is a challenge for many emerging economies and developing economies, that what you export cheap and then you have to buy expensive. India is maybe breaking that impasse.
Sure. Ma'am, let me ask you this. When we talk, if we look at the agenda of the G20 and B20 as well, there's a lot of focus on establishing resilient supply chains. Now, this is important because when you use the words resilient supply chains, it can refer to everything from food to superconductors. But let's focus on what affects countries in the G20 and beyond. We are facing a crisis with the Ukraine war, huge food inflation, oil inflation. So therefore, again, as part of the G20 concerns and agenda, how is ensuring resilient supply chains a key part of it?
I think it's three things. There is, of course, the big new term that we have learned post-COVID, which is friendshoring, which means bringing supplies closer to home. What we have seen in economies like China, even like the United States, is there is so much of growth that you can generate with domestic consumption, but at some point you need to go out and trade matters. And I think, again, the two largest trading partners in the world, the United States and China, still traded $9 billion, even as we talked about friendshoring. And we know that trade is really the driver of growth and the thing that lifts most people out of poverty the fastest and delivers financial inclusion. Now, as we move towards this sort of discussion, I think friendshoring is another term, maybe for some people call it deglobalization. I don't believe that's going to happen because at the end of the day, since we're in the B20 summit, the business community is looking at delivering shareholder value, and they have to optimize shareholder value. And my sense is that as one does that, one is going to go back to centers of the world where you have the best comparative advantage and where you can do that trade. Having said that, I don't think that before we started talking about friendshoring, we had optimized those trade relations. And so we can do much, much better. And that's a little bit what Brenda was talking about in terms of, yes, India used to export pharmaceutical products, but had you done it the best? I look at Africa, for example. When you look at a country like Kenya, Kenya produces antibiotics. But we haven't worked together to optimize the chain. I think we import, and what we found out in COVID is we import about 60% of the inputs for the production of antibiotics from India. But that supply chain was not optimized. And we can do that better. We can do that better by defining your private sector and our private sector. Same thing with Egypt, right? In Egypt, when the COVID crisis hit, Egypt is one of the largest producers of pharmaceutical products on the continent. But they overproduce for the continent and under-export. And so we can, again, optimize those markets with yourselves and ourselves. And my sense is that once we sort of revisit our supply chain conversation, we hopefully will find better optimization of some of those processes and products to be able to make sure that, because every product that we produce, I think we learned that the COVID vaccine has 140 inputs produced globally. And each one of those has a center where you can do it the best, the fastest, and the cheapest. And that's part of financial inclusion, is getting access to something at its cheapest cost. So my sense is we will work better on that. As a large country like yourselves, you can first optimize that just in India.
Sure.
And that's what's going to power your growth even better.
Mr. Brenda, over the last several years, the World Economic Forum has obviously changed your agenda, your outlook to reflect newer concerns and newer realities. One of the realities, of course, is climate change and sustainable growth. Do you find the WEF's agenda in that regard very aligned, in a sense, to what we are seeing at G20?
Very much so. I think we're on a daily basis seeing that this climate crisis is not something that our children or grandchildren will be faced with. That's what we used to say. We're doing it to secure their future. I think climate change is happening here and now, and we're paying a price. We see it, for example, affecting agriculture production in many places. The reality is that the cost of inaction now clearly exceeds the cost of action. But we are not seeing enough action, but I think India's G20 presidency underlines also the need of a faster decarbonization. And I think we need to change the perspective. It is cheaper to deal with it than just to postpone this change that is necessary. And also comes a lot of business opportunities with the decarbonization. But we are also reminded that it is tough, because it's like squaring the circle, in the sense that there is a lot of people even lacking access to basic electricity. We've seen also energy security issue in Europe. So how to make sure that you go towards the decarbonization, but at the same time you're able to deal with the energy challenges and access challenges. Because without access to energy, there will be no real development. And here, I think we need to be realistic with building bridges. There are, of course, better with natural gas than with coal. There's also better with fossil fuel if it's captured and stored. Of course, that is not the final solution, but until you get breakthroughs on technology and you get also cheaper energy like solar and wind as an alternative to the fossil fuel ones, you also have to think in a holistic way. And things do change very fast. If we had this conversation 3 years ago, I am not sure if AI was going to be mentioned at all. Of course, with my two very smart colleagues on the panel, they might have raised it. But you see how things change fast and new things come in. If we had this conversation 10 years ago and I said, oh, solar would go down to 1/10 of the price, or I would say wind would go down to 1/7 of the price in 10 years, people would say, oh, that guy is a little bit blue-eyed, you know, he's a bit naive. But no, many places in the world, solar is competitive. It's even cheaper than alternatives, and there's no subsidies needed. And there is like the new era, and I'm not going to be that long, but that also NK mentioned. The new technologies are also changing the way we have to think around economics. I was thinking when the Americans launched this new supply side economics with having a big stimulus in the middle of a situation where they tried to raise the interest rate, that this was going to be very, very challenging. And it seems like they're balancing it in quite a good way. So I think we have to look at austerity differently, but I also think we have to look at fiscal stimulus in a more positive way if it is targeted towards what we really want to achieve, digital inclusion, transformation of the way we produce energy, and etc.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Singh. Are you satisfied at the pace at which the cost of green energy solutions is coming down? Some would suggest it's not coming down fast enough.
Well, I think that whereas we can have 2 points of view on whether the speed of the decline in the cost, availability, and access of green energy is coming down or not, I think one of the very important enigmas is the financing of an orderly transition. And this is easier said than done, Vishnu. In the panel of which Veera is an important member, along with Larry Summers and myself, we are trying to estimate, and that's the heart of the reform of the multilateral development banking system, what is the financing requirement between now and 2030 to be able to have an orderly transition to a period in which dependence on renewable energy is high. That cost, in a brilliant report done by Veera, is estimated to be roughly $3 trillion a year. And $3 trillion, if we assume the $2 trillion out of the 3 come from domestic resource mobilization through much better economic management policy to growth and tax buoyancy and all the virtuous circles around it, that leaves $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a challenge which we are working on, of which $500 billion is from private capital. And therefore, what kind of incentive structures and catalyzation can be done to private capital of $500 billion a year in terms of risk mitigation, in terms of other measures. And then the balance $500 billion, which we hope can come through tripling the lending capability of multilateral development banks. Now, to give you a ballpark figure, Vishnu, all multilateral development banks, and there are many more than you can count. They are much beyond Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's a large family. If all of this is added, roughly speaking, they lend about $120 billion a year. The challenge that Veera and I are facing is how do you take $120 billion closer to $120 billion closer to $400 billion a year, which is tripling their lending capability. And what combination of measures will achieve that? What harnessing of innovative private capital, blended finance, hybrid capital, and what are those structures and mechanisms? I emphasize mechanisms. I emphasize mechanism because only yesterday and today, a mechanism was being talked about in the G20. And this is the connection that I see, of whether a part of the realization from what we call corporate social responsibility, in which India again has taken a lead. We are in the first country to have corporate social responsibility. Whether a fraction of that could go towards the ability to leverage fresh capital for mitigating the problems of climate, pandemic, transboundary challenges, and global public goods.
Ms. Songwe, the future of the the G20 as a grouping, and indeed if you look at countries around the world, rests closely with skilling and mobility and reskilling. Could you tell us a little bit more about how this is essential, because ultimately employment will improve the status of lives, countless?
No, thank you. And just to pick up on the points that were made, and the two meet, when you think about it, one of the reasons India is growing so fast is because the electric vehicle industry is booming, and we need to do that, and we need to do that more. 60 million more electric vehicles will be on our roads by 2050. For that, you need to be able to reskill. As I was listening to the CEO of Ford Motors the other day, and somebody asked him, so how do you think about Tesla coming into your market? And he goes, you know, Tesla is an IT company, we make cars. And Tesla has realized that designing cars is not that easy. And then the next day, they made a cooperative agreement. But beyond that, they also made a cooperative agreement with a mining company that does the chips. And my sense is we need to reskill as we talk about this transition, and this is the climate economy. And one of the things that we say in this report, and you should all look at it, which is the Trebling report, part of it is to build the capacity of the MDBs to do precisely that reskilling. We're going to need to take people from, you know, the financing, the banking sector to the digital banking sector. We're going to take people from just collecting data to data centers and AI. We're going to move people from fixing cars to being technologists that can actually make sure that you can drive a Tesla. And this is a whole reskilling process. And yesterday, we were in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. I was in Washington, D.C. And in the restaurant, they have a robot that shows you to your seat. Except that when you have tight restaurants, it shows you to your seat, but it blocks your seat. And so a human has to come and punch the process. But in Nairobi, we have a center called the iCloud Factory. And it's an amazing place. You go in there, and there's at least 3,000 young women especially, but also men who are in the university studying engineering. And they essentially program the driverless cars in California. They do the work for the football teams, and they sort of, and so my sense is the digital economy, the climate economy are going to be more job creating, but the only way they can do that is if we do this reskilling and we begin to train. It's not going to be a job destroyer. It's going to destroy some of the basic hand jobs that we do, but it's going to create a lot more jobs. And that is where we need the private sector. That is where we need multilateral development banks. And that is why we need the 400 billion. I want to end there. It's really in the report that we did on the trebling. It's really about trebling financing, but also trebling capacity. We must do the capacity bit. And the reason India is doing so well is you have done the capacity bit as well. If you had only done the IT bit, you would have gone no way. But measuring and bringing the IT bit, the capacity bit, and finally the regulatory bit together is what delivers value and growth.
You know, we were talking about job creation. I know that the World Economic Forum deals a lot with artificial intelligence, AI, and its future and its potential economic impact. Are you someone who believes that that might result in a loss of jobs?
I totally agree with what Overa said. If you can upskill, right skill people, there's huge opportunities also coming out of the fourth industrial revolution, including with artificial intelligence. So you also have to, you know, Churchill once said that the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And if you go through, start with the Industrial Revolution and go until today, all the different parts of the Industrial Revolution has led to that some jobs will then be, you will have to change, and some jobs are lost, but all the phases have created new opportunities where you can produce higher up in the value chain, and when you can produce and increase productivity, that's also increasing prosperity. I don't think there is any reason why this new phase of the industrial development will lead to less jobs. I think it will lead to more jobs and more interesting jobs, higher up in the value chain, higher prosperity, and increased and productivity. So, but of course there are some prerequisites for success there, and I'm worried that this winner takes it all that we have seen also when it comes to technology. We've seen it on the companies, and all this can continue. And here, I think we need to invest in developing countries also to give them the same opportunities, because there's then a lot of positive dividend when it comes to demography in these countries. And the young people are the ones that are really, really smart, and that we have to give opportunities in this new area. So of course, some of the old jobs will not be there in the future, but I think there will come better jobs. But you know, you have when there are so fundamental changes, you have no guarantee, even if you're doing well today, that you will do well tomorrow. If you look at, for example, the 10 companies that have the highest value today, market value, 20 years ago, 4 or 5 of them did not exist. Right. So in 20 years, I'm pretty sure there will be new companies there that maybe are startups or unicorns today. And 1/3, and India is number 3 in the world when it comes to these startups, huge opportunities in these countries. And it's the same with countries. Like if you look at Argentina in 1945, it was maybe the 2nd richest country in the world. They took the Peronistas 10 years, and then it was a lower middle income country. So look at the new technologies, embrace them, educate your people. If you have a good governance, you can also thrive and prosper.
Mr. Singh, one final question to you as we wrap this up. Mr. Bogo referred to startups. Now, we've been the startup capital in a sense of the world, but we've seen a little bit of a change. We've seen some companies not do as well as they expected to, a shakeout in a certain sense. Are you still optimistic about India continuing to be a major startup hub in the world?
Of course, I still continue to see India to be not only the prime mover, a catalytic, but an important destination for startups. I did say in the earlier part of this interview that technology is an enabler, but also a disruptor. I think that we are undergoing a period of that readjustment of startups with newer technologies in the horizon, with newer challenges in the horizon. I think as we readjust and recalibrate, I see that the vibrancy which we talked about in the startup will come back to this country with even greater force. Let me finally say, the first question which you had asked, Vishnu, was about the fact of the synergy between B20 and G20. India, in a couple of months from now, would hand over the presidency of the G20 to another developing country, which is Brazil. But as you know, Vishnu, the terminology of G20 is like a rolling stone. Every year, the presidency changes. What will be so vastly different about India handing over is that it has, in this period, managed to gather moss, indeed green grass, and that would be consistent with the Prime Minister's vision of handing over a green grass-grown presidency to its successors.
I think that's a wonderful opportunity to end this conversation. I'd like to thank the three of you very much for being with us. Lots to think about, not just about G20 this time, about where we are headed. Thank you very much indeed. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brende, Mr. Singh, and Ms. Songwei for joining us for that very insightful conversation. We'll begin our next session discussing how India has shaped the G20 and how the G20 is shaping India's global stature in just a short while from now.
Hi everybody. Whoever said money can't buy happiness was definitely not talking about climate finance. Hi, my name is Anubha Bhosle and you're watching a fresh new episode of The Climate Explainer. For the last 10 weeks, we have talked about all the things that can be done to slow down and adapt to climate change, whether it's by countries or by companies or you and I. Now, today I want to talk about what it all comes down to, and that's money. Climate finance refers to the funding and support that developed countries provide or are called to provide to help developing nations, including India, address the challenge of climate change. It aims to help global South countries foot that hefty bill of transitioning to cleaner, sustainable, and climate-resilient development paths. So, for example, buying carbon capture technologies to absorb all that excess CO2 emissions and store them away from the atmosphere. That technology is super expensive. Now, from a global South perspective, climate finance is vital for achieving net zero goals. Countries like India argue that they have contributed relatively less to the historical greenhouse gas emissions, but they actually bear a disproportionate burden of its impacts. I'm going to urge you to watch our episode on climate equity, where we explain the politics of this in detail. But for today, let me just say this much. Climate finance acknowledges this historical injustice and aims to redress the balance. So,
how has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20? And how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20 and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's Mega Conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped India's global position? NDTV's mega conclave brings together on one platform the biggest names behind India's G20 success. Join us on the 26th of August for a day-long event where we decode energy transition, clean growth, new digital economy, the business of G20, and India's big global moment. Decoding G20 only on NDTV. How has India shaped the G20 and how has the presidency shaped?
For 3 years. It's partly because India is growing, and it's partly because India has the G20 presidency, and we can talk a bit about that. And also long-term, this is going to be the center of the world, India and the Indo-Pacific, whether it's in population, whether it's in terms of economics. India will be one of the 3 defining countries of the rest of my life, alongside the United States and China.
Okay. You know, all through this morning, we've had several aspects of India's G20 leadership being discussed. Some say digital, some talk about the emerging economy, some talk about the power that India has become. According to you, what would be the defining aspect of India's G20 leadership? Whether it is cultural, whether it is psychological, what's the impact of this leadership from your point of view?
It's a little early to answer the question because, of course, we have the summit coming up in 2 weeks' time. But I would say that India has broken the mold on how you do a G20 presidency. I don't think any succeeding presidency is going to be able to go back to the past, because what India has done is to have this, take its huge scale and apply it to the G20. That means we've been to the most amazing parts of India. I was in the Andaman Islands at the start of the G20 presidency. It was a fantastic privilege to be there. You know, everywhere from Lakshadweep as well, there's been a meeting there, all over the country. And so that scale, and the great thing is it's brought a lot of people here. I'm sure it's true of the States as well. We've had, I mean, today we've got the global chief executive of HSBC, the global CEO of BP are both here. We've had I've had a cabinet minister every week for the last few weeks. Some of them are learning about India. Some of them know about India already. It was great to take our finance minister, who 30 years ago, like me, had lived in India, to come back and see Bangalore 30 years later. So the scale and the application of the scale, but also the ambition. And the ambition to tackle the big problems of the world. And I think Amitabh Kant spoke a bit about that this morning when he talked about global hunger, the fact that you have more people in poverty, the fact that you have low growth in some parts of the world. Finally, I think India and the G20 Sherpa has brought tremendous energy. We always talk about now moving on to renewables. I think if you wired Amitabh Kant up, I think you could probably power most of Delhi off that man's energy.
You, Atul? I'm a retired diplomat, so I'll give a business perspective because I now work for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I think India's vision that it has set out in its G20 year through all of the various events is very positive, it's very compelling, and it's very focused on the human being. You know, I grew up in Africa. I was born in Africa, grew up in Africa. Of course, I'm an American. I have an Indian parentage as well. And I see how what India is doing for its own citizens is potentially scalable for countries all around the world. You look at the fintech here, the digital empowerment, the environmental stewardship. These are positive visions. And so this G20 year has been remarkable, not just for all of the reasons that Alex has mentioned, but for the fact that it focuses on the human being. And this is where your business community and the American and British and other business communities help fuel the innovation that is going to help us all to live happier, more prosperous, and frankly, more meaningful lives. And the other great thing about the Indian vision for the G20 in this year is that it also focuses on the future freedom and happiness of humanity. And at the U.S. Chamber, we do believe in the founder's vision of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we see that in everything that India is doing. So I really applaud what India has done.
Okay, interesting points both of you have made, but as you go forward, and this is a year ago, we started having the Ukraine conflict. Has there been a change in the way India has been seen since then, or is that still the elephant in the room?
I'm very careful not to mix India and elephants in any metaphor, which I now try to produce. So the interest in India and India's power in the world is a long-term thing. Yeah? That's already there. It will grow a lot over the next decade. As I say, India will be one of the 3 most impactful countries in the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows the very contested world we're in, where an autocracy can basically invade a democracy and try to take its territory. We thought we'd kind of put an end to that in Europe, and Europe has had the most terrible experience of that, and thanks to the support of the United States, got over that experience. So it's a very shocking thing to see inside Europe. What you also see is the global consequences of what at first was described as a European war. But let's look at what's happened. Besides the terrible human damage done to people in Ukraine and to the territory of Ukraine, including its infrastructure, its dams, and so forth, that invasion has pushed up grain prices. Now, Russia firing missiles to try and wreck the ports of Ukraine to push up grain prices even further has an impact directly onto inflation in the Punjab. So this is a global issue. And I agree with what the Indian government said at the start, where you've got to respect territorial integrity, the rule of law, and the UN Charter. Now, the doing of that is tough. But I think that India will remain an extremely central country for the world. And we have to come together to find a way of dealing with what Russia has done in Ukraine.
Okay, taking that question one step further, one of the concerns has been that when you see foreign policy purely from a particular prism, are we then recognizing the predicament, if I can call it that, for a country like India in a situation of this nature, and how will this possibly be a barrier or a hurdle as you move forward?
So I think a lot of countries have been thrust into very difficult situations because of Mr. Putin's misadventure in Ukraine. If you look at the fuel prices and the food prices that the High Commissioner mentioned, it is having an extremely deleterious effect in countries in South Asia, in Africa, all around the world. And these are countries that don't have India's strength, They don't have India's prosperity. And so I think the collective, the world collective, has been trying to address these very dire implications, these global implications of the war. That said, we all, I think, agree that the war must end. It's unacceptable. There's a lot of human suffering. And that's where we have to focus on mitigating that human suffering. And that includes coherent economic policies that boost economic growth so that countries can get over, in many cases, foreign exchange crises that have happened. India, of course, has over $600 billion in foreign currency reserves. It doesn't face that crisis, but many of its neighbors do. And India has been exceptionally generous toward its neighbors. And the United States and Great Britain and others have worked very hard to try to mitigate that human impact. Also, I think there's a realization that countries have to develop closer relations. So, for instance, this year in my country, we had the great honor of welcoming the Prime Minister of India for only the third official state visit by a leader from India in the entire history of our relationship. It was, I would say, a sixer. You guys knocked the ball out of the park, out of the stadium, and had a magnificent visit that resonated so well with the American people and focused our future effort on the things that reflect our shared values, our shared work program, and bring us even closer together. So when these problems happen in world affairs, the challenge is how to react to them. And I think the US and India are reacting in a very constructive and positive way, looking at a very future-focused frame about the happiness of our countries, our citizens, and frankly, all of humanity.
Would you see that as a fundamental change in the Indo-US relations, post this visit? The fact that, okay, we have our sticking points, let's keep that aside, but we can't allow that to have an impact on the other aspects of our relationship, which has become essential for both sides.
So the wave chop in international relations is only getting higher. And there's a lot of uncertainty, geostrategic uncertainty. This is the worst war in Europe since World War II. And it has not been a short war. It is indeed lingering in ways that make life very tough for Ukrainian people and many others besides. But there's also geostrategic uncertainty in the Indo-Pacific region. And so I think that pragmatic, forward-leaning countries that are democracies like the United States and India find that they have even greater relevance for each other, including in things like the Quad with other democracies. This is the sort of collaboration that I think is going to be the focus of the United States and other countries going forward is who are our friends, with whom do we have shared values, and what can we do together to ensure the future happiness of humanity and human freedom. Again, I'm a retired diplomat, but these are my observations based on what I see as a very collaborative framework between Delhi and Washington over the past year.
Retired diplomats have the liberty of being a little more honest and open than a serving one. But, just putting this across, Amitabh Kant, and taking off from the point that you made, India Sherpa Amitabh Kant said the G20 under India's leadership is more powerful than the UN Security Council. How would you respond to that?
I'd like to point out that serving diplomats can also be honest as well. It's not part of the job description. So they do different things. What the G20 brings is the kind of mass of roughly 80% of the world's GDP, I would think. And that includes, and it's a body which can actually reflect the shift in growth over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, the sort of G7/EU GDP was about, I can't remember how much it was in the world, but it's roughly, it's dropped quite a lot. And, the new countries have grown a great deal. So it reflects that. It was actually revived by, dare I say, the United States and the United Kingdom in 2008 when we had the global financial crisis. If you remember then, there was a huge international effort led by the United States and the UK to try and address that problem. So it serves its purpose well. What I really like about the Indian presidency is kind of injected some new life into it and has that ambition about the big global problems we need to face. The UN Security Council and the UN system as a whole, well, it's the system we've got. It's the United Nations, and we've got to make it work. There is no choice in that from my point of view. It needs reform. The Security Council definitely needs reform, including India coming onto the Security Council. But you have to make work what you have, because at the same time as the world's probably more divided than when I've been kind of working professionally. I joined the Foreign Service in 1990. The big global problems have got bigger. And so you have that tension between both the sort of the dysfunctional parts of the international system, but the need for it to address the really big things, health security, climate security, a whole host of other stuff.
So given that point that you make, saying that the world is more divided, would something like a G20, and I'm just trying to understand the import of that statement, would G20 become then a possible additional platform where you could have conversations even between these two sides, which are very difficult? Countries like India could potentially be the ones which can facilitate the conversations in a divided world.
I mean, to be honest, there is Russia invading Ukraine, and then there's most of the rest of the world. So in that sense, most of the rest of the world would say, we really want to get on, as India does.
And China as well on another side.
I mean, China has a particular position as well, and that's been tough work. I must say, can I just pay respect to the G20 presidency for trying to persevere with getting agreed texts and stuff like that. This is really important stuff. Digital public infrastructure, deforestation, we have been backing the Indian presidency all the way. So actually, I think the vast majority want to get on with dealing with those issues. The trouble is, one of the members of the G20 invading a democracy to kind of inject something very poisonous into that international system, and that's what we're trying to deal with.
You would like to add on to that?
I think the UN Security Council would greatly benefit from having India on board.
That's an interesting one. In terms of your quintessential moment of India's G20 presidency, if you were to take one defining moment in this whole thing, what would that be? I mean, is there something, or would you like to wait for the leaders meet before you choose the moment that you want?
So for me, whenever I come to India, I feel like my dreams as a little boy have come true. Because I've been coming to India since I was a baby. My parents came here every year for the first 15 years of my life. And we would go to Panipat and sit in my grandmother's house with no electricity. There was certainly no internet back then. There wasn't even TV. I remember when the flush toilets were put in. So I'm revealing my age a little bit. But when you look at the India of today, and I've been very privileged and fortunate to go all around this country in the recent past, it is amazing the pace of revolutionary change in the lives of Indian people. If you look at telephony, I remember when it took almost an act of Congress to make a telephone call between Panipat and Delhi. You had to book the call, then go home, then wait for the kid to come and say, no, now the call has come. Then you scream down the phone line. With a little bit of age, you gain perspective. And I feel like that India of my dreams has already been achieved. What is critical now is to see in this G20 year the realization of the dreams of the Indians of today. And I think India is going to achieve those dreams. It is truly going to shine on the global stage over the next 30, 40, 50 years. And it's frankly going to make the world better. So I'm very positive and optimistic. I've seen this country come so far. I see Indians living happier lives. And I pray that that continues for a very long time to come.
Well, that's reflective of the people-to-people contact we've had over decades between both the countries. And when you speak about that, as far as the UK is concerned, one of the sticking points, one of the issues that's in conversation at the moment is the free trade agreement. Is there a deadline for it? Is there something you can, in your honest self as a diplomat, serving diplomat, give us a little bit of a insight into what's happening?
I've just come out of the meeting between our two trade ministers, Piyush Goyal and Kemi Badenoch. That was a very good meeting. Our minister would always say text before time, that you have to get the text right rather than setting artificial deadlines. I think, firstly, we have come a long way. We actually closed the majority of the chapters of the FTA. Secondly, we're now discussing today some of the tough stuff which we need to deal with to get this deal right. It has to be a deal which works for both sides. But I think, thirdly, I saw kind of determination and ambition on both sides to get this done. It's a huge opportunity for both sides. It provides a lot of economic benefit. It'll increase trade and investment, and that's got to be good for both of our countries. I think it has a strategic benefit as well. Going back to what Atul was saying earlier about the kind of world we're in, that between two democracies, which are the fifth and sixth biggest economies in the world, you can create a trade deal. I think that sends a pretty powerful signal to the rest of the world about what can be done.
Okay. And in terms of increasing free movement between the two countries, it's again, it looks very differently when you look at it from an India point of view. It looks very differently when you see it from a Washington or a London. what steps do you think are being taken, or the concrete roadmap for that?
So I think it's critical that we facilitate the free movement of free people in order to ensure the strongest possible growth of the US-India relationship. Wait times have to be addressed, and they are being urgently addressed by my former colleagues, and I applaud them, and I hope they succeed famously. One of the most important elements of this is the announcement in the joint statement of the President and the Prime Minister to announce 2 new consulates of the United States in India, in Bangalore and in Ahmedabad, and increasing Indian consulates in the United States. This is very, very important. However, we still have to speed it up so that people don't have to wait so long. This is, in a way, although it's no consolation, a very good problem to have, because what it reflects is the sheer demand for travel between the United States and India. And you see all of the proliferation of nonstop flights between our 2 countries, something unimaginable when I was a kid. You had to transfer Frankfurt at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so we've come a long way, but we urgently need to fix the problem. And I'm very happy in my conversations with my colleagues, former colleagues at the US government, that they understand the problem, they're working very hard on it, and they're putting real money and resources into trying to address it.
In the case of the UK, India tops all 3 of our main visa categories: students, visits, and skilled workers. A third of all visas in those 3 categories go to Indian nationals. India's overtaken China as the #1 supplier of international students to the UK. I'm delighted to say, sorry Atul, that our waiting times are excellent. Turning around our visit visas in 13 days within the 15-day working day standard. So there's a huge flow. Now that's an old flow as well, and you can see that by the inhabitants of number 10 Downing Street. I mean, did you ever imagine that you would see the person who lives in number 10 Downing Street on India's National Day, the 15th of August, in one of the greatest and oldest universities of the world, saying Jai Shri Ram? Yeah? I think Lord Curzon would have... as I said, Lord Curzon would have choked on his kedgeree if he'd ever heard that. So it tells you something about the change in the UK and the benefit which having that flow of people between India and the UK brings. We do have one problem, and the problem is I want more British people to come here. I think that not enough people in the UK know the reality of India today and India tomorrow. And to go back to the question you asked earlier, which I took a really good response to, if I have one thing which defines me that India's G20 presidency, is that when a British minister comes here, when a British official comes in, they come all over the country, what they see is tomorrow's world.
Interesting. That's a real deep insight into what you see. As we build on this going forward, what do you think are the critical challenges ahead? Because much of this is still work in progress. And what do you think are 3 or 4 things that India as a country needs to be extremely cautious about? And also, from a global point of view, that people are looking very closely at as indicators for the road ahead.
I'll talk about the UK and India together, but also the world more generally. The promotion of freedom and opportunity around the world is going to be one of the biggest challenges and the most important things, because you want to give the next generation those opportunities. So we have to do that together. One of the things you learn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine is that every country needs friends. Ukraine is much smaller than Russia, but it has friends, and it sees the opportunity. It's brought the country together, and I think we have to learn from that to develop that opportunity. Number 1. Secondly, we have to do this sustainably. What India does internally in terms of the building of the cities of the future, the infrastructure of the future, is going to determine to an extent what happens to our climate. Now, it's tough on India. India didn't produce these emissions historically. My country did, the United States did. But we have to work together to find the solutions of the future, and that is very much a joint effort. The third one I'd pick out is health and health security. The best thing the UK and India have done together in a very long time is the Covishield vaccine. Started in a great university in the UK, developed by a British firm, but then India's vast scale and capacity to produce a vaccine, which is a complex thing to produce, and put it into over 1 billion people, including in the neighbours. I completely agree about the generosity of that. That is something you do together. And those 3 things seem to be worthwhile tasks for the next 20 years.
Hi, Commissioner. May I steal your phraseology from your previous question? It was so superb about how when you come to India, you get that sense in the G20 year of the vision of the future. I love it. So hopefully I'll avoid paying royalties on it, but I'm going to steal it and use it a lot. If I may, I'll confine my response to the business and economic environment. I think this is, in fact, emphatically India's golden moment. The whole world is realizing the stability and the opportunity and the reliability and the positivity of India. And so my respectful appeal would be, and I hear this from the members of my trade council, is that in this golden moment, India can do a lot to appeal to the psychology of capital. Investment in will create jobs, it'll create prosperity, it'll result in exports, it'll create a boost in GDP. Frankly, seeing India be a $5, $10, $20 trillion economy is good for the United States, it's good for the entire world, and we want to see it happen. So in this regard, my mantras, or shlokas as it will, are ease of doing business, level playing field, and regulatory and policy predictability. If these things happen, I think you will see the world of global business beat a path to your door and help accelerate the process of India's rise to becoming potentially the largest economy on earth.
As you make that point, quick last few questions. Do you believe domestic political developments in the US perhaps would have an impact? Is there a growing, one gets all kinds of news from the US. So would you believe that those would have an impact in the long term? How is that being seen across the board?
Well, you could have a closed system where you hide all of your flaws and problems, where you don't have a robust internal debate, your people can't speak freely, and someone tells them what to do. I personally don't think that's a good governance model for humanity. We are free, and we should remain free. So in the United States, and I speak as a private citizen, the disclaimer I'll keep issuing, we do our business in public, in the harsh light of the TV glare light, of the lights. And that's kind of healthy, right? Ours is a robust, messy democracy. Every one of our citizens proudly expresses their opinions, and it's cathartic. I would argue that coming out of the pandemic, free societies like India, the United States, the United Kingdom have powered through the pandemic and have come out of it much better off. We've had a brutal time, we've lost millions of citizens, and yet our democracies essentially reinforce the robust nature of our societies. There are many other models that are far more brittle, that have a lot more risk. And so our democracy is 240 years old, it is robust, it has been through some really tough times, and I think it will continue to power through because we do it in a very cathartic kind of manner as free people do.
We're not yet trumped as yet. So, you've had a great time in India. You've enjoyed the food, you've had the music. Is there one above all that you find the most attractive aspect, the aspect that you enjoyed the most?
I love the food. I was having a dal bati last week in Jodhpur with some churma afterwards, absolutely fantastic. Rasgulla in Casey Das in Kolkata, I remember that, it's fantastic.
And you're
all
still
the Bengalis out there.
That's
Just thought I'd better get that in there. I had my head taken off by a lal mas in Jaisalmer, which took me to the extremes of everything. It was an amazing dish. Great fish curry in Goa as well. Actually, I love the food. I'm a cricket nut, so I love all that. And as you know, I love the music too. And
is there a song that you'd like to sing for us?
Well, you have a wonderful national anthem.
I'm from South India.
We have a great national anthem as well. But I was thinking, what is the song which we should be singing together in the future? Which, and I thought, Ye dosti hum nahi chhodenge, todenge dam agar मैं तेरे बारात के साथ ना छोड़ेंगे.
Wow. That's fascinating. Do you want to have a go?
I am going to defer and submit and bow down to the High Commissioner of the United Kingdom. He did a great job. But what I will say is that India delights me every day in so many different ways. The food, obviously, the fact that there's been so much development in the course of my lifetime. And India touches the heart in unexpected ways all the time. I have a daughter who was born here in India, and so India remains immensely precious to me. My wife and I spent some of our most wonderful years in the Foreign Service here in India, and so that feeling of the heart always abides. And I wish India the greatest of success and happiness.
Well, I think the most beautiful aspect of the song that you sang is that I'm from South India and it's still iconic for me, Amitabh Bachchan and Dharmendra and a bullet singing this song. So that's possibly the story of India. Ye dosti hum nahi chodenge. So that's fascinating for the two of you to have shared your thoughts. If there is any question from the audience, don't ask them to sing another song. Anything else is okay. Please, sir.
Both of you, can you throw some light on that?
Sir, could you repeat your question? Because we have a television audience watching this as well. And
shall I answer the question by repeating the question? The question was about how do you end the war in Ukraine, given the situation on the ground, sir, if I understand, General. And, well, there's a simple answer, which is Russia goes back to its own territory, and Ukraine is allowed to live in its own territory. And I think anyone in this room is going to be sensitive to autocracies deciding arbitrarily to invade democracies. What you have to have is to look at across the whole thing, and actually Zelensky's produced a peace plan, others have as well. But you have to, if you concede the principle that an autocracy can occupy a democracy's land and stay there, then that is a very concerning principle for the world as a whole. In the end, it will require international support. That's why I think India was right to reference the UN Charter in its first statement it made about it. We are going to have to find a way to deal with this. But it is tough.
On that note, I think we'll have to end this conversation for the next session. I'm sorry, we don't have time for any further questions. Thank you, too, for that fascinating conversation, and thank you, High Commissioner, for that. What's the word? for the song. Fascinating.
Show stealer.
Lovely. Show stealer, yes. Thank you, too, for joining us.
Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Ye dosti hum nahi todenge. That's the message coming in straight from the United Kingdom for India ahead of the G20 summit. Now, as we move on towards the conclusion of our session, our last panel for the day is extremely special, our last interview for the evening. An important focus for the G20 has been rethinking fuel and moving towards cleaner sources of energy. Now, India has taken major steps in adopting new and future sources of energy. Solar energy accounts for a significant share of India's renewable energy portfolio, and several innovations in renewable energy have come from India. You heard the Union Minister, Mr. Hardeep Puri, earlier in the day saying that green hydrogen is the future green fuel. But India has also raised its voice for just energy transition, saying that the global north needs to take responsibility for its actions and for climate finance as well. For our closing panel, it gives me great pleasure to invite the Union Minister for Power, Mr. R.K. Singh. Joining him on stage will be NDTV's senior anchor and consulting editor, Mr. Sanket Upadhyay. I welcome Mr. R.K. Singh and Sanket Upadhyay on stage for an interview.
Once again, welcome back to this grand finale on the G20 Conclave right here on NDTV. आज दिन भर हमने तमाम लोगों की बातें सुनी और मकसद ये बातें सुनने का सिर्फ एक था, ये जानने के लिए कि ये जो G20 समिट होगी भारत में, उसके पीछे का उद्देश्य क्या है, जो बातें हो रही हैं वो क्या हासिल करेंगी। अंत में बात है पावर की, और पावर सत्ता हथियाने वाली पावर नहीं, पावर मतलब बिजली, ऊर्जा। So we are happy to have with us on stage Minister of Power and Minister of New and Renewable Energy, Mr. R.K. Singh. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
It's a real pleasure.
मेरा सबसे पहला सवाल ये है, और मैं शुरू ही इससे करना चाहता हूँ। G20 को लेकर के हमने देखा है कि it is a matter of great pride for India to host the G20. तमाम जगह इसके हमने पोस्टर देखे हैं, घर घर तक ये बात चली गई है कि G20 की समिट भारत में हो रही है। It's a matter of great pride for everyone, for the fact that we are playing host to so many countries. But sir, एक आम आदमी के लिए जो ये पोस्टर देख रहा है, जो ये सारी चीज़ें देख रहा है, इतना बड़ा समिट हो रही है, इस समिट के अंत में जब बड़े बड़े लोग चले जाएंगे, इस समिट से उसके लिए संदेश क्या होगा?
G20 समिट में जैसे कि अन्य मल्टीलैटरल फोरम में होता है, कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑफ पार्टीज इत्यादि में होता है, या G7 में होता है, वो देश और दुनिया के भविष्य की एक ट्रेजेक्टरी क्या हो, भविष्य के लिए रास्ता क्या हो, इस पर बातचीत होती है कि व्हाट शुड बी द पाथ विच द डिफरेंट कंट्रीज द वर्ल्ड शुड टेक looking at the challenges before it. And that determines, actually, that impacts everyday lives. जैसे कि मैं अपने क्षेत्र को ले लूँ, ऊर्जा को, बिजली को, ऊर्जा को, तो ऊर्जा किस प्रकार का हो, यह हर एक आदमी को इम्पैक्ट करता है. It impacts every person, because everybody uses energy. Everybody uses energy. Whether that energy comes from fossil fuels or non-fossil fuels is a question which has an impact on what your cost of electricity will be. That is a question on what, it is going to have an impact on the availability of energy. So that is how vital these discussions are, either here or in the Conference of Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we discuss and debate the future of the world, what the world needs to do in the circumstances which are prevailing. Now, the circumstances which are prevailing are, number one, that climate is under, you have climate change. The environment is in peril. This is something which is accepted all over the world. Now, there are very few naysayers who say that global warming is a myth. There used to be a time when you had people saying that, people in high positions saying that global warming is a myth. No more. And the world feels that, you have to have an energy transition in order to meet that, in order to stop or delay global warming, or stop it. And that impacts everybody. वो सबको प्रभावित करता है कि हम किस तरह से एनर्जी बनाते हैं. अब जैसे मैं बता दूं, अगर आज आप कहेंगे कि फॉसिल फ्यूल बिल्कुल रुक जाए, तो 24 घंटे बिजली मिलने में कठिनाई होगी, इसलिए कि रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी दिन में है जबकि सूरज है. When the sun shines, you can make solar. When the wind blows, and the sun shines only during the day, it doesn't shine at night. And when the wind does not blow, you don't have energy. So you need storage. Now, storage is expensive. And the world has not addressed it. The developed world. I have a grouse with the developed world for that. They've been talking about how important it is to stop global warming and how important climate change is, but they did nothing about it. So storage is absolutely essential if you want round-the-clock renewable energy. And today the price of storage is, I had a bid of 1,000 megawatt hours. It was one of the largest bids in the world. And the price came to 10 rupees per kilowatt hour. Whereas my renewable energy cost is 2 rupees 60 paise per kilowatt hour. So you get 1 unit of energy for 2 rupees 60 paise. To store it for 1 hour, you need to pay 10 rupees. So the total cost comes to 12 rupees 60 paise. Now, that's not viable. So you have to add volumes for storage. Now, we are doing that. But if the developed world had started doing this when they really when they had started talking about the climate, then today we would not have had such a situation. So actually, whatever we discuss has implications for the common man. It has implications for the rate of growth of the country. Because you can't have growth without energy. I mean, there won't be any industry without energy. Your ventilators, your lifts, nothing will run without electricity. And therefore, energy security is the most important thing. Now, I'll tell you one thing, that what we have done is that we have emerged as a country whose rate of transition is one of the fastest in the world. Our rate of renewable energy capacity addition is the fastest in the world, not one of, but is the fastest in the world. We have achieved our NDCs 9 years in advance. And all this while making sure that electricity is available for our growth. And and that growth is actually substantial. You have our country growing at 7.2%. My power demand grew at 6.7%. The difference between the growth between 2021 and 21-22 was 6.7%. And the growth between 21-22 in demand, I'm saying, the growth between from 21-22 to 22-23 was 6.3%. In 23-24, in the first quarter, the growth was 7.8%. In July, the growth was 9.7%. In August, the growth has been 21% in demand terms and 16.7% in energy terms. And that in a huge country whose total demand, the peak demand is 234,000 megawatts. You have to add, I think, most of the countries of Europe to come to that. But we are meeting it. That peak demand of 234,000 megawatts, the shortage was only 236 megawatts out of 234,000 megawatts. So that's what we've done. We've grown. We made sure that our electricity supply is as required for our growth, and it will continue to be so because we are adding capacity, huge capacities. And we have at the same time emerged as the only country whose energy transition actions are commensurate with a sub-2-degree rise in global temperature. So as I was telling my friend here, I told my friend two things when I landed. So I am wearing a dress which I should have been wearing. But that was, that apart. So I told him this, that when I first joined in 2017, and it's almost 6 years now, then, my interlocutors from the Western countries used to come and talk to me about how necessary it is to transition, things like that, and how India should be doing more. Now, no more. It just took me 2 years. And after that, now nobody sort of talks to me about that. They are mostly on the defensive because I tell them that, look, I've done this. What have you done? So we are in a different place.
I think that's, let's pick up from the point where you have left. Do you feel that it is slightly rich on the part of the developed world to expect a lot from leaders and countries in the global south to do more to address the issue of climate change, whereas even now as we speak, they are polluting more?
Absolutely. I'll tell you what. You see, just look at the figures. And that's why, now people from the developed world become defensive when I start, when they come and meet me. Our per capita emissions are 2.19 tons per year. The world per capita emissions are 6.4 tons per year. That's per capita. So our per capita emissions are 1/3 of the global average. The per capita emissions of the developed world are 3 times to 4 times the global average. Now, what needs to be done? If you want to actually limit the global rise in temperature to 1.5 degrees or less, then the per capita consumption has to come down to 2.4 tons. We are very close to that. And the developed world has to reduce its per capita consumptions from, let's say, 18 tons or 20 tons down to 2.4. Now, that's what they have to do. But despite the fact that we are one of the lowest emitters in the world, as I said, we had pledged, what we pledged in COP21 in Paris, that by 2030 we'll have 40% of our capacity coming from non-fossil fuel sources. We achieved that in 2021, 9 years before the due date. Today, my capacity, non-fossil fuel capacity is 43% in capacity terms, 43%. And that's why in Glasgow, we upped our ambition and said that by 2030, we will have 50% of our capacity coming from non-fossil fuel sources. And believe you me, I mean, I'm very close, I'll be very close to achieving that, give a year or so. And by 2030, I will have 65% of my capacity coming from non-fossil fuel sources. Because I already have about 187,000 megawatts of non-fossil fuel capacity. I have about 88,000 megawatts under construction of renewable, non-fossil, 88,000 megawatts. That's, already 276,000 megawatts, 276 gigawatts. And I have about 50 gigawatts under various, the bids, etc. So I'll cross that target. 50%, I'll reach 65%. Instead of 50%, I'll reach 65%. Emissions intensity we have reduced. We had pledged that by 2030, we'll reduce our emissions intensity by 33%, despite the fact that our emissions intensity, as I said, per capita emissions are one of the lowest in the world. And we achieved that in 2022. Because we have some programs which the industry will tell you are the best in the world. Many countries came and copied our program, the program for industry, perform, achieve, trade, where we, lay down specific energy consumption reduction targets. And if you meet that, fine. If you don't meet that, you pay a penalty or you buy energy saving certificates. If you, overachieve, you get energy saving certificates. So that has resulted in a reduction of CO2 emissions by 105 million tons per annum. 105 million tons of CO2 reduction per annum. That's one program. The LED program has resulted in emissions reduction for almost about 103 million tons per annum. Our star rating program, 5-star, air conditioners, 5-star fridges, etc. Now that has resulted in emission reductions of almost 53 million tons per annum. So we have a program for construction, the commercial buildings, the Energy Conservation Building Code, which sets energy consumption standards for commercial buildings, large commercial buildings. And that is mandatory. We have a non-obligatory Eco-Niwas Samhita for residential buildings. We are going to make it mandatory. We are a world leader in energy transition, in climate action. We are a world leader. And at the same time, we are growing. Now, one more thing you must understand, and this is something which I tell the audience everywhere, because unless we know what we have done and what we are doing, we'll not know what the discourse is about, what the narrative is about. And believe you me, that the narrative being spread out by some NGOs in the developed world are totally misleading. And they don't tell you, talk about these figures. They'll, for example, tell you that, look, India is a huge country, therefore its total emissions are high. But that's besides the point. I mean, that is ridiculous. You don't decide about the emissions depending on the size of the country. A small island will be consuming huge quantities of energy per capita, yet its overall emissions will be less. You have to talk about it in per capita terms, like you talk about GDP. So the narrative, has to change, and unless until we know the facts, that narrative won't change. So that's why I say this, that we are in a good pace as far as energy transition and climate action is concerned, and that was one of the vital points for discussion in G20, and it will remain a vital point for discussion in all multilateral fora, because climate change is a challenge, which is looming. It's there, it's right in front of you. So it will be a vital point.
Yeah, Mr. Singh, these figures that you have presented are impressive, no doubt. The fact that we are 9 years ahead of our own target and our own schedule that we promised to the world.
We promised, NDC, not our own. It's an
yes,
NDC. Yeah.
The promised, yes. I'm just quoting a report in the Reuters from the 6th of April, 2023, not doubting these numbers that you have presented, because you're the master of what you're learning. But according to this report, fossil fuel power output rose fastest in 3 decades. Emissions from power generation rose to 1.15 billion tons. Coal-fired power output was up 12.4%. Gas-fired output down 29%. Share of coal in overall power output was up to 73.1%. You can challenge these figures. I will take no blame for this because it's not my report. This is the Reuters. And it also says, if you allow me, that renewables output also rose by 21.7%, the share up to 11.8%. Do you feel that while you present impressive numbers, 73.1% coming from coal,
Now, let me tell you this. You see, this just shows the narrative which is being spread around. Now, if you have an economy which is growing at 7%, the electricity has to grow at 9%, 10%. I just gave you the growth figures. Now, if that grows at 9%, 10%, then the coal and the electricity from coal will also grow. My PLF has gone up to 70%. It used to be around 50%. It has to grow if I have to meet that demand. Of course, it will grow. But the point is that our renewable energy capacity is growing faster. As I said, today we have almost 177,000 megawatts which are pure renewable, solar, wind, hydro, biomass, etc. So that will grow, but the wind will, but the thermal will also grow. Now the thermal will grow because, as I said, the sun does not shine at night, the wind does not blow at times, so you have to rely on thermal unless the battery becomes cheaper. And we are talking about a country which is going to grow, keep growing, and it needs energy. And they are talking about countries which have reached, almost the pinnacle of their growth. They are developed countries. So that the paradigm has to shift. That narrative has to change. You must realize one thing. And some figures are wrong. For example, today. And his figures also don't add up, let me tell you. You have 73% coming from fossil, not coal. Okay. So the the correspondent who wrote that, he didn't know.
Which is why I said,
he didn't know what he was talking about. So
I attributed.
So he didn't know what he was talking about. I mean, the Reuters correspondents can also be ignorant. See, you must get rid of this mentality, that if it is a Western-based source, so it must be sacrosanct.
I will place these figures in doubt.
Listen to me, listen. And that whatever they say is sacrosanct. Forget it. That's not so. For example, I'll tell you. Actually, let me first answer this. So my total fossil fuel energy is 73%. But that is not only coal. That also includes gas. I have about 24,000 megawatts of gas-based capacity. And my non-fossil fuel energy is in the region, varies day to day depending on the wind, etc., or the sun, about 24%. So the electricity which you see, 24% of that is already renewable. Now tell me what? And 43% of my capacity, 43.5% of my capacity is already non-fossil. Now tell me what? I have increased my renewable energy capacity by 2.5 times in 9 years. Now tell me any country which has done that. And all these figures are there. So tell your Reuters chap to remove his dark box and look at the figures. And one more thing I'll tell you. I will meet the requirement of energy for my growth. Why? I have a right to grow. And till so long as battery storage is not viable, and it is not, as I said, I had one of the largest bids in the world, and tell me which other country has that 1,000 megawatt hours, and another bid of 3,000 megawatt hours of pumped storage, which came to, and the lithium ion bid came to 10 rupees per kilowatt hour. The pumped storage came to about 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. Unless and until that goes down, I will have to rely on fossil fuels. And I'm talking about, and stop talking about coal, talk about fossil fuels. You see, that is the grouse I have with these developed countries. I mean, the hypocrisy is amazing. You see, they talk about coal. They don't talk about the fact that, you have gas, which is also fossil, that also gives out carbon dioxide in huge and copious quantities when you burn it. Right. They don't talk about shale, which gives out, the, carbon dioxide in copious quantities when you burn it. And the shale gives out carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to to coal. But they don't talk about that. So somehow or the other, they got in, they smuggled in a line in COP26 in Glasgow about, the phasing down coal. Thereafter, I was not there, whichever meeting I attended, I said, don't talk about coal, talk about all fossil fuels. You phase down, I have coal, I burn coal. You have gas, you burn gas. You phase down fossil fuels, I agree to phase down fossil fuels. And right now, as I said, I have about 73%, 43% is from non-fossil, so I have about 57% capacity-wise coming from coal and gas. That will come down to 33% by 35% by 2030. So that's fast enough.
Let me ask you this question, Mr. Singh. You see, according to this PIB article on the 3rd of August 2022, it talks about the Panchamrit of India's climate action, right? This includes net zero by 2070, cumulative electric power capacity from non-fossil fuel sources, 40%. You have addressed some of these things. 50%, yes. Reduce emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35%. This was updated later. I'm just talking about that Panchamrit, the commitment, and then how we renewed it, which is also, I would say, a great example to set that you are not only meeting your targets, but setting yourself revised targets. Where do you find India on this Panchamrit that we had promised?
I told you. Number one, we are the only country which has met our NDCs way in advance. The NDCs you read out were actually what we pledged in COP21 in Paris. Now that we have already achieved. We had pledged that by 40%, we'll have 40% of our capacity coming from non-fossils by 2030. We achieved that in 2021. Today I have 43.5% coming from non-fossils. Tell me any other country which has achieved its NDC so far in advance. Tell me any other country which has achieved all its NDCs. We had pledged that by 2030 we'll reduce our emissions intensity by 33%, despite having the lowest per capita emissions. Now Reuters doesn't talk about the per capita emissions, does it? It doesn't talk about the 5 SUVs in every home. It doesn't talk about it. So that's the hypocrisy. So this is the NDC which we already achieved well in advance. That's why we increased our ambition. We increased our targets by ourselves in Glasgow, in COP26. And so now 40% becomes 50% by 2030. And in fact, I'll get it well before that. Because as I said, I have 188 gigawatts installed, 88 gigawatts under installation, 276 gigawatts, 50 odd gigawatts under bid, etc., in different phases. That's 320 odd already. My total capacity in 2030 will be about 770 gigawatts. 50% of that is 350 gigawatts.
Mr. Singh, I mean,
So as I said, I will not only achieve that before time, I'll go beyond it.
Which is why I'm very curious to ask you this question. The nationally determined
contribution. And tell me
contribution.
which developed country has done this. Name one. And name one developed country which has reduced its per capita emissions. Name one. There you are.
Which is why I want to ask you this question. The nationally determined contribution which we have revised ourselves, setting ourselves extremely ambitious targets and achieving them and revising them also, do you feel that there is a very strong chance that we will achieve our net zero emission ahead of 2070?
Absolutely. I have no doubt about that. But there are two things which you must know and understand. You see, as I said in the beginning, every developing country, and I'm talking about the global south, has a right to grow, right? The developed countries have reached a certain level of per capita incomes. We have a right to grow to that. Now, growth entails consumption and emissions. Now, I'll need to add millions of square feet, trillions of square feet of real estate. My housing will grow, my buildings will grow. That needs cement. That needs steel. Now, if I make steel, you have emissions. If I make cement, you have emissions. And therefore, unless and until CCUS, carbon capture and sequestration, becomes viable, that carbon dioxide will be there. And that's one of the wages of growth. You must know one more thing, that our population is about 17% of the world population. Our contribution to the legacy carbon dioxide load, which has caused this rise in temperature 0.89 degrees, is just 4%. That's where we are at. I mean, you won't have Reuters talking about this. You won't have that. And despite all this, as I said, we have emerged as a leader in energy transition. Despite the fact that our contribution to the legacy carbon dioxide load is, 1/4 of what our population is, less than 1/4 of what our population is. So we'll grow. We'll need more cement. We'll need more steel. We'll need more aluminium. Now, CCUS, and I've been asking questions to all my interlocutors who come from abroad that, okay, you're talking about net zero by 2045, 2050, one or two countries 2045, some countries 2050. How will you do it? I mean, unless you have storage which is viable, which is affordable, you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy. If you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy, then you can't sort of phase out fossil fuels because you need electricity at night, even for heating, lighting, whatsoever. So it's one of my interlocutors, minister, in a large developed country, he said that, no, we'll go nuclear. I said, how? I mean, that country has about 40% of its capacity coming from nuclear. I said, how much nuclear capacity will you add? Where will you store the waste? There's a question mark. There's a question mark. He talked about small modular reactors. Now, small modular reactors are only still under development and still under research. So what's your path to net zero? CCUS, you don't have any commercial scale CCUS, even in your country, which is developed, which is a huge country. You just have pilot scale. I also have pilot scale CCUS. And even if you have CCUS, where do you sequester it? CCUS means carbon capture and sequestration. Where do you sequester it? So the answer was that we'll sequester it in the voids left by pumping out oil. So I said, what's the guarantee it won't leak back up? I mean, so these questions are there. So net zero has questions. Storage. Unless and until you have storage, you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy. If you don't have round-the-clock renewable energy, you don't have, you can't get to net zero. And storage is expensive. The lithium ion, I mean, the total capacity around the world would not exceed, I think, about 20 gigawatts or something like that. We are setting up, we had a PLI for battery storage. We are coming out with another PLI for battery storage. We are building capacities. The developed world did not do that. The 88%, 90% of the lithium processing is in one country, in China. The developed world talked about climate, but they did not add capacity. That's why we are where we are today. That's why the storage is not cheap. So these questions, they don't answer. They don't have answers for that. We are adding capacities. We'll continue adding capacities.
Would you want to raise these at the forum?
I do that. I do that. That's
all
the
time.
I do it all the time. So that's why they become very defensive when they come in front of.
Do they still like you? For being
I'm
so
not bothered.
straight.
I don't. My constituents like me. I won elections twice.
Good. That's good.
That's
I
good
think
enough
that's
for
good.
me.
That's all that matters.
The people who need to vote for me, they vote for me. So fine. Yeah.
It's interesting. You mentioned a word called nuclear. Now, I just thought in 2000, that in the erstwhile UPA government, that government went big on betting on nuclear energy as perhaps the way to meet India's energy requirement. Where are we vis-a-vis, attaining these goals and using nuclear?
Yes. I mean, we want to expand nuclear, no doubt about that. My current nuclear capacity is about 4,700 odd megawatts.
You think it should increase?
Huh?
You think it should increase?
Absolutely. We want, we have nuclear capacities under planning stage and construction stage of about 15 gigawatts, 15,000 megawatts. We want to do more on this. But we have to keep that in mind, the safety aspects. So that is something. But we are nowhere near where the developed countries are. I mean, you have France, which has almost about 55% of its capacity of its energy coming from nuclear. As you have another large country in the United States, I think almost 40% of its capacity is coming from nuclear. So our nuclear is minuscule, and the rate of growth of capacity is also slow for many reasons. One, of course, was you have the NGOs kicking up a row as soon as you start constructing nuclear power plants. You had Conclave, etc. That huge row. I was Home Secretary then, so that huge row broke out. And I was curious to find out, who was financing this. Once I started investigations, the row died out. And you have the plant there. Similarly, you look at the developed world, they have exploited 89% of their hydro capacity. When we started adding to our hydro capacity, you had NGOs sort of demonstrating. And, we went before I carried out a survey. Not carried out a survey. I actually engaged an IIT to carry out a survey, independently of the impact of hydro projects on environment. And the results, are totally different from what has been portrayed. That survey report I have released. In fact, I'll send that to you.
Mm-hmm.
The survey found that wherever hydro projects have been constructed, the incidence of landslides has decreased. It's not increased, it has decreased.
Now that's
news,
yes, Mr. Singh.
It found that the environment around that project improved. The water retention capacity, the flora, the fauna has improved.
No, Mr. Singh, many environmentalists will not agree with you. Because many environmentalists
it's a research.
feel,
It's not my data. Yeah. And research by an IIT, and the figures are there for everyone to see, and we have released it openly. So let anybody, till now, nobody has come up with figures.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
I think this report should be seen, reported on, and perhaps,
Please.
That'll be great.
Yeah.
Now,
I'll send a copy if you want.
Sure.
I mean, my Pawan is here somewhere.
Sure.
So send a copy.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll wait for Pawan ji to send it. In the meanwhile, एक सवाल मैं हिंदी में आपसे इसलिए पूछना चाहता हूँ क्योंकि गुजरात चुनाव के दौरान जब हम वहाँ गए तो वहाँ लोगों के घर में जो हो रहा था वो देख करके बहुत इंटरेस्ट आया और वो इसलिए आया क्योंकि वहाँ पर लोग ये कह रहे थे कि हम बिजली सिर्फ ग्रिड से ले ही नहीं रहे हैं, एक ऐसा सिस्टम है यहाँ पर क्योंकि हमने अपनी एक सोलर पैनल लगाया हुआ है तो हम ग्रिड को कंट्रीब्यूट भी कर रहे हैं और वो प्लस और माइनस हो करके कभी कभार वो कहते हैं हमको पैसा आता है,
एकदम आता है,
पैसा देने बिजली का बिल देने के बजाय हमको बिजली की कंपनी पैसा देती है,
एकदम
सो वी आर कंट्रीब्यूटिंग टू द ग्रिड.
एकदम आता.
हाउ होपफुल आर यू कि ये मॉडल पूरे देश में लागू हो जाए क्योंकि हम दिन में तो कम से कम बहुत ही धूप रहती है, रोशनी रहती है.
नहीं, देखिए, हम आशाओं में विश्वास नहीं करते, हम तो विश्वास करते हैं करने में. हमने एक नियम बना दिया. नियम है, नियम यह है कि हमने उस नियम का नाम हमने रखा है राइट्स ऑफ प्रोस्यूमर्स. यानी कि कंज्यूमर होता है उपभोक्ता, प्रोस्यूमर होता है जो कि प्रोड्यूस भी करता है, बिजली पैदा भी करता है और कंज्यूम भी करता है, यानी कि अपने रूफ पर सोलर रूफटॉप लगाता है. उसका हमने एक नियम बना दिया है कि कोई भी व्यक्ति कह सकता है कि हमको अपने छत पर सोलर चाहिए और सोलर लगाने का उसको अधिकार है. डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनी, जो वितरण कंपनी है, उसमें आपत्ति नहीं कर सकती है और आप लगाएं. 3 किलोवाट तक जो भी उसका खर्च आएगा उसका 40% मैं दूंगा, भारत सरकार देगी. हमने पहले तो होता था कि हम राज्यों को कैपेसिटी देते थे और उनको कहते थे कि आप लगवाइए. उसके बाद वो तो हम करते ही हैं. उसके बाद फिर हमने एक पूरा वेबसाइट बना दिया. आप कहीं भी देश में कहीं भी हो, आप उस वेबसाइट पर जाएं, आप उसमें अपने घर का पता होता है इंडिकेट कर दें उसको और आ जाएगा कि हमको सोलर लगाना है कितना किलोवाट का. इंसिडेंटली मैं बता दूं, 3 किलोवाट तक 40% हम देते हैं सब्सिडी और 3 किलोवाट से लेकर के 10 किलोवाट तक 20% हम देते हैं. तो उसमें प्रथम 3 किलोवाट के लिए 40% दे देंगे, अब बाकी 7 किलोवाट के लिए हम 20% देंगे. और ये नेट मीटरिंग होगा. नेट मीटरिंग का मतलब है 500 किलोवाट तक. नेट मीटरिंग का मतलब ये है कि अगर आपका कंजम्पशन है सपोज 200 यूनिट है तो आप 200 यूनिट वाले ब्रैकेट में हैं और आपके सोलर जो पैनल है उसने प्रोड्यूस किया, ये करीब 150 यूनिट प्रोड्यूस किया, तो आपको पेमेंट करना होगा सिर्फ 50 यूनिट के लिए. अब वो 50 यूनिट पेमेंट करना होगा वो लोअर रेट पर क्योंकि आप उस ब्रैकेट में आ जाएंगे. तो आपको बहुत सारा ये गेन होगा, बेनिफिट होगा. तो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनियां नहीं चाहती थी इसको, इसीलिए हमने नियम बना दिया. ये आपका अधिकार है, वेबसाइट है. एक तो ये स्टेट्स करती हैं, हमने टेंडर करने का स्टेट्स को कर दिया है, अब वो कर भी रही हैं. लेकिन वेबसाइट पर जाएं, अपना इंटीग्रेटर चुने कि हाँ साहब सो हमको फलाना कंपनी चाहिए इंटीग्रेटर. वो आकर करके सर्वे कर देगा और आपको बता देगा कितना किलोवाट लगेगा. आप ओके कर दीजिए, आकर के लगा देगा और ये अपलोड आप कर दीजिए कि लग गया तो आपके अकाउंट में पैसा सब्सिडी का पैसा.
मतलब सिंह साहब ये कोई भी कर सकता है,
ये कोई भी कर सकता है. कोई बैंक अगर लोन नहीं देती है आपको तो हमको बताएं, क्योंकि सभी बैंकर्स को बैठा करके हमने उनको तैयार कराया है कि आप फंडिंग करेंगे, फाइनेंसिंग।
I think this is a great
कोई आपत्ति नहीं?
This is a great point on consumer awareness where you can actually not just consume power but be a producer of power also.
और ये हम होर्डिंग अब इंडिया में सब जगह लगाने वाले। वैसे तो सब जगह लगाने के लिए मैंने अपने मंत्रालय को कहा कम से कम 6 महीना पहले, तो अभी तक लग ही रहा है। मैं उसको फिर चेंज कर रहा हूँ।
आपने अपने मंत्रालय की क्लास ले ली। Mr. R.K. Singh, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
NDTV Conclave. And now we count down to the big G20 summit in the national capital. In about 2 weeks from now, 20 global powerhouses will gather here in the national capital, including the United States, China, Russia, Japan, and the United Kingdom. These countries aren't always on the same page together, but it'll be a challenge as they'll all come together under the same roof here in Delhi in 2 weeks. Today, we made an attempt to demystify and to decode these complexities surrounding the G20 summit. With this, we come to an end of this mega NDTV conclave. I'm pleased to say that NDTV's G20 conclave has truly been a mega success with the participation of top ministers, officials, global voices. And this really wouldn't have been possible without all of you. I take a moment from all of us at NDTV. I thank all of you for your time and for your patience throughout the day. I also thank all our guests who joined us for these insightful conversations. It was truly an honor to host these conversations. I'd also like to take a moment to give out my special thanks from all of us at NDTV to our sponsors, Dr. Ortho for co-sponsoring the conclave, and Golden Grand and Allstone for co-powering the conclave. We also thank our state partner, the UP government, and we hope these conversations that we had on the conclave today with the top voices behind India's G20 presidency serve as food for thought as they set the tone for what India can achieve from the G20 summit and what it can give back to the world. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great evening.